There are places in history that were never meant to be understood, not because we haven't tried, not because we lack the tools, but because the deeper we dig, the less sense things begin to make. Across ancient deserts, buried beneath collapsing civilizations, and hidden within landscapes long abandoned by time, there are structures, discoveries, and moments that refuse to behave the way history says they should. A tomb with no body, a chamber built with precision, yet left incomplete. A discovery so strange, so deliberate, that it feels less like an accident and more like something that was suddenly stopped, or worse, something that was never meant to be finished at all. Because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries aren't the ones that were lost, but the ones that were abandoned, left behind, frozen mid-purpose, as if whoever created them never came back. And the question is, why? The unfinished pyramid that should not exist, beneath the relentless sun of Egypt, where the desert stretches endlessly and the past lingers in every grain of sand, lies a structure that feels wrong. Not ruined, not destroyed, just incomplete. It doesn't rise proudly like the pyramids of Giza. It doesn't command awe from miles away. And it doesn't tell a clear story of kings, power, or legacy. Instead, it sits quietly, almost forgotten, a half-formed monument, a structure that looks as though time itself simply stopped building it. This is the unfinished pyramid of Zoyet El Arayan. And unlike the great pyramids that surround it, this one doesn't answer questions, it creates them. At first glance, there's nothing particularly remarkable about it, just a rough, uneven mass of stone blocks, barely rising from the desert floor. No smooth casing, no polished finish. It feels abandoned, but that's only what you see on the surface. Because the real mystery isn't what's above the ground, it's what lies beneath it. Deep within the structure, hidden below layers of rough stone and unfinished corridors, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected. A chamber. Perfectly carved, geometrically precise, and completely empty. No sarcophagus, no inscriptions, no trace of burial, nothing. Just a silent, hollow space, waiting. Now, in ancient Egypt, pyramids weren't just buildings. They were machines of immortality. Every angle, every chamber, every passageway had a purpose to guide the soul of a king into the afterlife. Nothing was random. Nothing was unfinished. And yet, here we are, standing inside a pyramid that seems to have been abandoned at the exact moment it mattered most. The accepted explanation is simple. Too simple. Most historians believe the pyramid was built during the Third Dynasty, possibly under a pharaoh whose name barely survived history, Kaaba. A ruler so obscure, so poorly documented, that even his existence feels uncertain. According to this theory, construction began, but something went wrong. Perhaps the design failed. Perhaps resources ran out. Or perhaps the king died too soon, leaving the structure unfinished. It sounds reasonable, logical, even expected. But there's a problem. Actually, several. First, if the king died, why wasn't he buried here anyway? Ancient Egyptians didn't just abandon tombs, they adapted. They completed what they could, because burial wasn't optional. It was essential. So why leave a perfectly carved chamber completely empty? Second, the chamber itself shows signs of deliberate planning. The angles are precise. The layout is intentional. This wasn't a rushed or failing project. It was calculated, carefully designed. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the structure was so carefully planned, why stop? And third, there's something deeply unsettling about the way the chamber feels. Even in modern explorations, researchers have described it as unusually stark, not damaged, not eroded, just untouched, as if it was built for something that never arrived. This is where the theories begin to shift, because once you move past the official explanation, things start to get strange. Some researchers suggest that the pyramid may have been abandoned due to structural instability, that the ground beneath it was unsuitable, that cracks or weaknesses forced the builders to stop. But again, that doesn't explain the chamber, the most important part of the pyramid, the part that was already completed. Why leave that behind? Others propose something more political. Perhaps Kaaba lost power. Perhaps a new ruler took over and chose to erase his legacy. This wasn't uncommon in ancient Egypt. History was often rewritten, quite literally. Names erased, monuments repurposed. But even then, why not reuse the structure? Why not finish it under a new name? Why abandon it entirely? And then there are the less comfortable theories, the ones that don't fit neatly into history books. Some believe the pyramid was never meant to be a tomb at all, that it served a completely different purpose, something ritualistic, something symbolic, or something we no longer understand. There are suggestions that the chamber may have been designed for ceremonies rather than burial, that it functioned as a place of transition, not for the dead, but for something else, something not recorded. Others go further. They point to the precision of the chamber, the alignment, the way it seems intentional in ways that go beyond simple construction, and they ask, what if the pyramid was part of something larger? A network, a system, a design that connected structures across Egypt in ways we still don't fully comprehend. It sounds extreme, until you realize how little we actually know, because even today, despite decades of study, the unfinished pyramid remains one of Egypt's least understood sites. It doesn't fit, not with the timeline, not with the purpose, not with the logic of everything else we've discovered. And then there's one final detail, one that makes the entire mystery even harder to ignore. The chamber shows no signs of interruption, no evidence of collapse, no indication of disaster, no tools left behind, no debris suggesting panic or urgency, just stillness, as if the worker simply stopped and walked away. No explanation, no continuation, no return. So what happened here? Why would an entire Project 1 tied to eternity itself be abandoned so completely? Was it a failed pyramid, a forgotten king's tomb, a political erasure, or something else entirely? Because sometimes the most disturbing part of a mystery isn't what we find, it's what we don't. An empty chamber, a silent structure, a purpose that was never fulfilled, and perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is that whatever this pyramid was meant for, it didn't fail. It was never meant to be completed. Hidden deep within the barren cliffs of Egypt's Valley of the Kings, there is a tomb that should have been simple, ordinary, routine, just another resting place among dozens of others carved into the rock for kings, queens, and forgotten royals. But this tomb didn't stay ordinary for long, because the moment it was opened, nothing made sense. It didn't begin with something dramatic. There were no golden treasures spilling into the corridors, no walls covered in vibrant hieroglyphs telling stories of gods and eternity. Instead, it was quiet, plain, almost unfinished. And that was the first sign something was wrong. This was Kefi 55, a tomb discovered in 1907 by archaeologist Edward Ayrton, tucked within the Valley of the Kings, one of the most sacred burial grounds in all of ancient Egypt, a place reserved for power, for legacy, for rulers whose names were meant to echo through eternity. But KV5 didn't echo anything. It whispered, and what it whispered didn't match history. At first, the tomb appeared unremarkable. The walls lacked decoration. There were no grand inscriptions, no elaborate depictions of the afterlife. It felt stripped, as if whatever identity it once had been deliberately removed. And then they found the coffin. It wasn't like the others. The craftsmanship was unusual, not crude, but not royal in the way archaeologists expected. It seemed altered, modified, almost as if it had been repurposed. And when they opened it, they found a body. At first, everything seemed straightforward. Another royal mummy, another piece of Egypt's long, complex history. But that assumption didn't last long, because the moment researchers began to examine the remains, the contradictions began. The body inside the coffin didn't match the tomb, and it didn't match the story. The mummy appeared to belong to a young man, somewhere between his late teens and early 30s. His bones showed signs of youth. His features, though damaged, suggested someone who had not lived long enough to reach old age. But according to early theories, this was supposed to be a king, a very specific king. Many believed the body belonged to Akhenaten, one of the most controversial pharaohs in Egyptian history. a ruler who had done something almost unthinkable. He tried to erase Egypt's entire religious system. Akhenaten rejected the traditional gods, all of them, and replaced them with one single deity, the Aten. A move so radical, so disruptive, that it fractured the foundations of Egyptian society. Temples were abandoned. Priests lost power, and an entire civilization was forced to adapt, almost overnight. But revolutions like that don't fade quietly, and neither did Akhenaten. After his death, everything he built was systematically undone. His name was erased, his monuments dismantled, his legacy buried. So when K55 was discovered, many assumed this was him, a disgraced king, hidden away, stripped of honor, forgotten by design. It seemed to fit, at least at first, because when scientists began studying the body more closely, the timeline didn't work. Akhenaten was believed to have ruled for around 17 years, meaning he would have been significantly older at death. But the mummy in Chapter 55? Too young. Far too young, and that's where everything started to fall apart. If this wasn't Akhenaten, then who was it? Some suggested it could be Tutankhamun, the famous boy king. But that theory didn't hold either. The physical features didn't match. The burial context didn't align. And Tutankhamun's tomb, famously intact, had already been discovered elsewhere. Others proposed a more obscure figure, a shadow in history, a name that appears briefly and then disappears. Smenkhare, a possible co-ruler, a figure so mysterious that historians still debate whether he even truly existed. Some believe he was Akhenaten's brother, others say his son, and some suggest something even stranger, that Smenkhare wasn't a separate person at all, but another identity. But again, no definitive proof, no confirmation, just another theory layered on top of uncertainty. And then there's the coffin itself, because it tells a story of its own. Originally, the coffin appeared to have been made for a woman. The facial features, the inscriptions, the design elements, all suggested a female royal. But at some point, it had been altered. The face was modified, the inscriptions were changed, names were erased, rewritten, covered over. It was as if someone had taken an existing coffin and tried to repurpose it for someone else. Quickly, imperfectly, almost urgently. Which raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Why would a royal burial be rushed? In ancient Egypt, death rituals were sacred, precise, carefully executed. There were rules, processes, traditions that had been followed for centuries, but K55 breaks those rules. The burial feels incomplete, improvised, out of place, and perhaps the most unsettling detail, the damage to the body itself. The mummy showed signs of unusual treatment. The skull had been damaged, the chest cavity disturbed. There were indications that the burial process had not followed standard practices. It wasn't just rushed, it was wrong. Some researchers believe this was intentional, that the body was deliberately desecrated, punished, even in death. If that's true, then whoever this person was, they weren't just buried, they were rejected. But rejected. But rejected by who? And why? Was this Akhenaten, a king erased from history and denied a proper burial? Was it Smenkhare, a forgotten ruler caught in the collapse of a religious revolution? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone whose identity was so inconvenient, so dangerous, that it had to be hidden? There's another possibility, one that makes the entire mystery even more unsettling. What if the tomb wasn't meant for this body at all? What if KV55 was originally intended for someone else, and this burial was a replacement, a last-minute decision, a relocation, a concealment? Because when you look at the evidence, the mismatched coffin, the altered inscriptions, the incomplete burial, the young body, it doesn't feel like a planned resting place. It feels like a correction, as if something went wrong, and this was the solution. But solutions leave traces, and KV55 is full of them. There are fragments of funerary equipment that don't belong together, pieces from different sources, different styles, different origins. It's not a unified burial. It's a collection. And collections don't happen by accident. So what are we looking at? A hidden king? A mistaken identity? A mistaken identity? A political cover-up? Or something even more deliberate? Because there's one final detail that continues to haunt researchers. Despite over a century of study, despite modern technology, despite nodder analysis and countless examinations, no one can say with certainty who is buried in K55. Not definitively, not conclusively, not completely. And that might be the most disturbing part of all, because in a civilization obsessed with identity, with legacy, with ensuring that every name lived forever, this one didn't. It was erased, altered, rewritten. And now, all that remains is a body in the wrong tomb, in the wrong coffin, with the wrong story, and a question that refuses to go away. Who was never supposed to be found here, buried beneath the ancient sands of Saqqara, where countless tombs stretch across a landscape built for eternity? There exists a discovery that does not belong. It is not grand. It is not decorated. It does not carry the dignity that death was supposed to have in ancient Egypt. Instead, it holds something deeply unsettling, something that feels almost wrong. Because in a civilization where death was carefully controlled, preserved, and perfected, this burial looks like something went terribly off script. The body was discovered in the early 20th century during excavations led by archaeologists exploring the vast necropolis of Saqqara. At first, there was nothing particularly unusual about the tomb itself. It was modest, quiet, and easily overlooked among the more elaborate burials that surrounded it. But when the sarcophagus was opened, everything changed. Inside lay a man whose final moments appeared to have been captured in a way that defies explanation. His body was twisted, his limbs were bound, and his face was frozen in what could only be described as a scream. His mouth hung open unnaturally wide, as if caught in the exact moment of terror. His jaw appeared locked in place. His expression was not peaceful. It was not calm. It was not the serene face of someone prepared for the afterlife. It was the face of someone who had experienced something so intense, so overwhelming, that even death had not erased it. And that is where the mystery begins. Because in ancient Egypt, death was not supposed to look like this. The process of mummification was designed to preserve the body in a state of dignity and stillness. Muscles were treated, limbs were positioned carefully, and the face was arranged to reflect peace. The journey into the afterlife required order, control, and ritual precision. There was no room for chaos, no room for fear. And yet, this man was buried as if none of those rules applied. At first, archaeologists assumed there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps the body had shifted over time. Perhaps the wrappings had loosened. Perhaps natural decomposition had caused the jaw to open in a way that only appeared dramatic. These things can happen. Bodies change. Time alters everything. But the more closely the remains were studied, the less convincing those explanations became. The position of the body was not random. The bindings on the limbs were deliberate. The posture suggested restraint, not accident. And the expression on the face, while possibly influenced by natural processes, was far too intense to be easily dismissed. It did not look like a peaceful death disturbed by time. It looked like a moment that had been preserved intentionally. And that possibility changes everything. Because if this was intentional, then someone chose to bury him this way. Which raises the question, why? One of the earliest theories proposed that the man may have been a criminal. In ancient Egypt, those who committed serious offenses were sometimes denied proper burial rituals. Their bodies could be treated differently, positioned in ways that reflected their status as outcasts or traitors. The bindings on the limbs seemed to support this idea. Perhaps he had been executed. Perhaps his final moments were violent. Perhaps the expression on his face was a reflection of that end. But this theory quickly encounters a problem, because despite the disturbing posture and expression, the body had been mummified with care. The preservation process was thorough. The wrappings were applied properly. The techniques used were consistent with those reserved for individuals of significance. This was not a rushed or careless burial. It was methodical, intentional, respectful in its execution, even if the result appears anything but respectful. And that contradiction is difficult to ignore. If he was a criminal, why preserve him so carefully? If he was an outcast, why ensure his body would survive for eternity? Punishment and preservation do not usually coexist, unless there is something else at play. Another theory suggests that the man may have died in a state of extreme physical distress, possibly from suffocation or poisoning. In such cases, the body can sometimes lock into positions that reflect the final moments before death. The jaw may remain open, the muscles may tense, the face may appear frozen in anguish. It is a plausible explanation, but it still does not address the bindings, nor does it explain why his body was placed in such a deliberately constrained position. Because even if his death was painful, his burial did not have to reflect that pain, unless it was meant to. Some researchers have proposed that this could have been a form of ritual, that the positioning of the body, the bindings, and even the expression were symbolic, that the man may have been part of a ceremony or a practice that we no longer understand. In ancient Egypt, rituals surrounding death were complex and varied. There were moments of transformation, of passage, of symbolic rebirth. But even within that framework, this burial stands out. It does not resemble known ritual practices. It does not align with documented traditions. It feels isolated, unique, almost as if it belongs to a different set of rules entirely. There is also the possibility that this man held a specific role in society. Some have suggested that he could have been a prisoner of war or a foreign individual brought into Egypt under unusual circumstances. His burial, then, might reflect a blending of cultural practices or an attempt to impose Egyptian rituals onto someone who did not belong to that system. But again, the evidence is limited. There are no inscriptions identifying him, no artifacts indicating his status, no clear markers of origin. He exists in isolation, a single body with no story attached, and that absence of context only deepens the mystery. Perhaps the most unsettling theory is the simplest one, that the man was buried exactly as he was found, that nothing was adjusted, nothing was corrected, nothing was softened, that his final expression, his final posture, his final state was preserved deliberately. If that is true, then this burial was not about honoring the dead. It was about capturing something, holding on to a moment, a specific moment, the moment of death itself. But why would anyone want to preserve that? What purpose could it serve? Was it a warning, a message, a symbol of something we no longer understand? Or was it something more personal? Something connected to the individual rather than the culture? Because when you look at the body, there is something deeply human about it, not in the sense of recognition, but in the sense of emotion, fear, pain, shock. These are not abstract concepts. They are immediate, instinctive, and somehow across thousands of years they remain visible on his face. That is what makes this discovery so different from others. Most ancient remains feel distant, removed. They belong to another time, another world, but this one feels close, too close, as if the boundary between past and present has been thinned. And for a moment, you are not looking at history. You are looking at an experience, a final moment that was never meant to be seen, and yet here it is, preserved, unchanged, unexplained. Despite years of study, advances in technology, and countless attempts to interpret the evidence, no single explanation has been accepted as definitive. The identity of the man remains unknown, the cause of his death remains uncertain, and the reason for his burial remains unresolved. He exists as a question, a silent one, because he cannot tell us what happened, and the people who buried him left no record, no explanation, no justification. Just a body, bound, twisted, and frozen in a scream that has outlived everything else, and perhaps that is the most disturbing part of all. Not that we do not understand it, but that we may never be able to. Because whatever happened in that moment, whatever caused that expression, whatever led to that burial, it was not meant to be remembered. It was not meant to be studied. It was not meant to be found, and yet somehow it was. And now, thousands of years later, we are left with a single unsettling question. What could have happened to a man that made even death look like fear? High in the remote regions of Ecuador, far from the centers of ancient power and civilization, there once surfaced a collection of objects that, if genuine, should not exist. Not because they are impossible, but because they do not fit. They do not align with the timeline, geography, or the understanding of how human civilizations developed. And yet, for a brief moment in history, they were very real. Seen, documented, and then slowly, quietly gone. The story begins in the early 20th century, in a place that most people at the time would have considered unremarkable. Small communities scattered across the Andean foothills. Farmers working the land, uncovering fragments of history with no expectation of what those fragments might mean. It was here that a man named Father Carlo Crespi, an Italian missionary stationed in Ecuador, began to collect unusual artifacts brought to him by local villagers. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about this. Missionaries often served as intermediaries, gathering cultural objects, preserving them, sometimes sending them back to institutions abroad. But what Crespi began to receive was not typical. The objects were metallic, intricately designed, and unlike anything associated with known indigenous cultures of the region. Gold plates etched with strange symbols, silver sheets bearing geometric patterns, and most unsettling of all, thin metallic tablets covered in markings that resembled writing, but not any writing that should have existed there, because some of these symbols appeared strikingly similar to ancient scripts from entirely different parts of the world, shapes that echoed cuneiform, patterns reminiscent of early Mesopotamian inscriptions, designs that seemed, at least at first glance, completely out of place in South America. It would be easy to dismiss this as coincidence. After all, simple shapes can appear similar across cultures. Lines, triangles, repeating patterns. These are not unique. But the consistency of the markings raised questions, not just isolated similarities, but repeated forms, structured arrangements, intentional designs. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because if these artifacts were authentic, they suggest something that challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions in history, that ancient civilizations developed largely in isolation, especially those in the Americas. That contact between distant cultures, particularly across oceans, did not occur at the level required to exchange knowledge, symbols, or writing systems. But these objects seem to hint at something else entirely. Crespi continued to collect them over the years, amassing what would later be referred to as the Crespi collection. Hundreds of items, each one adding to the sense that something unusual was happening. Some pieces depicted figures that did not resemble known indigenous art styles. Others showed what appeared to be technological imagery objects that some interpreted as machines or even vehicles, though such interpretations remain highly controversial. One particular artifact drew significant attention: a golden plate featuring a circular object with radiating lines, interpreted by some as a stylized sun, by others, more controversially, as something resembling a flying craft. The interpretation depends entirely on perspective, but the fact remains, the imagery did not fit comfortably within established frameworks. As news of the collection spread, it began to attract attention from researchers, historians, and curious observers. Some saw it as a groundbreaking discovery. Others immediately dismissed it as a hoax, a collection of fabricated objects created to mimic ancient styles. The debate intensified, but what followed made the situation even more complicated. The artifacts began to disappear, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. Pieces went missing. Some were reportedly taken by authorities. Others were said to have been transferred to institutions. There were claims that parts of the collection were moved to the Vatican. Other accounts suggested that government agencies became involved, though documentation is scarce and often contradictory. By the time serious efforts were made to study the collection in detail, much of it was no longer accessible, and that absence creates a problem. Because without the objects themselves, analysis becomes speculation. Authenticity cannot be confirmed, materials cannot be tested, context cannot be established. All that remains are photographs, testimonies, and fragments of records, none of which are sufficient to draw definitive conclusions, which leads to two possibilities. The first is simple. The artifacts were not authentic. They were created, intentionally or unintentionally, to resemble ancient objects. Perhaps local craftsmen produced them. Perhaps they were inspired by stories, myths, or misunderstandings. Over time, these objects accumulated, and their significance was exaggerated. It is a reasonable explanation. It requires no rewriting of history, no radical shifts in understanding. It fits comfortably within existing frameworks, but it does not explain everything, because even if some objects were fabricated, it does not account for the consistency of certain features, the repetition of symbols, the apparent structure of the markings, and most importantly, the scale of the collection. Hundreds of items, all sharing similar characteristics, all emerging from the same region, all pointing towards something that feels coordinated rather than random. Which brings us to the second possibility, that at least some of the artifacts were genuine. And if that is the case, then the implications are difficult to ignore, because it would suggest that there was contact, direct or indirect, between distant civilizations far earlier than currently accepted. That knowledge, symbols, or ideas may have traveled across oceans in ways we do not fully understand. That the history of human interaction is more complex than the models we rely on. It does not necessarily mean advanced technology. It does not require extraordinary claims. But it does challenge the idea of complete isolation. And that challenge is significant, because historical narratives are built on patterns, on evidence that fits together in coherent ways. When something appears that does not fit, it is either integrated through new understanding or dismissed as an anomaly. The Crespi collection sits uncomfortably between those two options. Too strange to ignore completely, too uncertain to accept fully, and then there is the question of suppression. It is a word that appears often in discussions about these artifacts, the idea that information was intentionally withheld, that discoveries were concealed to prevent disruption of established narratives. It is an appealing theory, but also a dangerous one, because without evidence it becomes impossible to distinguish between genuine concealment and simple mismanagement, loss, or lack of documentation. Still, the pattern is difficult to overlook. Artifacts appear, they attract attention, they raise questions, and then they vanish, leaving behind just enough to suggest something was there, but not enough to prove what it was. In the decades since Crespi's collection first emerged, researchers have attempted to track down surviving pieces. Some have claimed to locate fragments in private collections. Others have reported seeing items that resemble those described in early accounts, but no comprehensive recovery has been achieved. The collection as it once existed is gone, and with it the opportunity to examine it directly, which leaves us in a position that is both familiar and frustrating. A story with incomplete evidence, a mystery built on fragments, a possibility that cannot be confirmed but also cannot be entirely dismissed. And perhaps that is what makes it so compelling, because it sits at the edge of understanding, not clearly within history, not entirely outside it, just beyond the point where certainty begins. If the artifacts were false, then they represent an elaborate and enduring fabrication, one that managed to convince enough people, for long enough, to become part of historical discussion. If they were real, then they point toward a chapter of human history that is yet to be fully explored. Either way, the result is the same. We are left with questions, not dramatic ones, not sensational, but quiet, persistent questions that remain unanswered. What were these objects? Where did they come from? And perhaps most importantly, why are they no longer available to study? Because sometimes the mystery is not what we find, it is what disappears. And in the case of the Crespi artifacts, what disappeared may have been just as important as what was discovered. In one of the most desolate regions of the Middle East, where the land stretches into endless silence and the wind reshapes the earth without resistance, there exists a structure that should not be there. It does not connect cities. It does not protect anything. It does not even seem to follow logic. And yet, it stretches across the landscape with a persistence that suggests purpose. For decades, it went largely unnoticed, not because it was hidden, but because it was too simple to attract attention. A long, low stone wall cutting through the desert of Jordan, known today as the Kat Shabib. From the ground, it appears insignificant. Rough stones stacked in uneven lines, sometimes no more than a meter high. It does not resemble the great walls of history. It does not dominate the horizon or inspire awe. It simply exists. But when viewed from above, everything changes. The wall stretches for more than 100 kilometers, winding through hills, valleys, and barren terrain. It does not follow a straight path. It bends, shifts, and sometimes appears to stop entirely, only to begin again further along. There are gaps, interruptions, and segments that feel disconnected from one another. It is not a continuous barrier, but a series of connected fragments that together form something far more puzzling than a simple structure. And that is where the questions begin. Because walls, by their very nature, are meant to do something. They divide, protect, enclose, or mark boundaries. They have direction. They have intention. They are built with a purpose that can usually be understood even centuries later. But the Khatchabib resists that understanding. At first, the most straightforward explanation seems reasonable. Perhaps it was a defensive structure, built to protect a region from invasion, to create a boundary between territories, or to control movement across the desert. This is a common use of walls throughout history, and it would not be unusual to find such a structure in a region that has seen countless migrations and conflicts. But almost immediately, that theory begins to fall apart. The wall is too low to function as a serious defensive barrier. In many places, it could be stepped over without difficulty. It lacks the height, the fortifications, and the strategic positioning that would be expected of a structure designed for protection. There are no towers, no gates, no signs of reinforcement. It does not guard anything, and it does not stop anyone. So if it is not defensive, perhaps it is a boundary marker, a way of defining territory, separating regions, or indicating ownership of land. This, too, is a common function of walls, especially in areas where written records were limited and physical markers were necessary. But again, the details do not align. The wall does not follow natural borders. It does not align with rivers, ridges, or other geographical features that would typically define territory. Instead, it cuts across the landscape in ways that seem arbitrary. It divides nothing clearly. It connects nothing obviously. It does not create a meaningful separation between distinct regions. And then there are the gaps, long stretches where the wall simply disappears, not destroyed, not eroded, but absent, as if it was never completed or never intended to be continuous in the first place. These gaps are not small interruptions. Some extend for significant distances, breaking the structure into segments that do not form a coherent whole, which raises a difficult question. Why build a wall that does not function as a wall? Another possibility is that the structure served an agricultural purpose. In some regions, low stone walls are used to manage livestock, control grazing areas, or prevent soil erosion. They can act as simple barriers to guide animals or protect crops from environmental damage. This explanation has some merit. The height of the wall would be sufficient to influence the movement of animals, and the materials used are consistent with local construction methods. It is a practical use, grounded in everyday needs rather than grand designs. But once again, the scale complicates things. The wall extends far beyond what would be necessary for localized agricultural use. It covers vast distances, crossing terrain that does not appear suitable for farming or grazing. There are no clear indications of associated settlements, no evidence of infrastructure that would support large-scale agricultural activity. It is too extensive, too disconnected from obvious resources to be explained solely as a tool for managing land. So if it is not defensive, not territorial, and not agricultural, what remains? Some researchers have suggested that the wall may have had a symbolic or ceremonial purpose, that it was not meant to serve a practical function, but rather to represent something, a boundary not of land, but of meaning, a division between the known and the unknown, the inhabited and the sacred, the ordinary and the significant. This idea is difficult to prove, but it cannot be dismissed entirely. Ancient cultures often built structures that carried symbolic weight, monuments that marked spiritual spaces, pathways that aligned with celestial events, or constructions that reflected beliefs rather than needs. In such contexts, functionality is not measured in physical terms, but in cultural significance. But even within this framework, the Khatchabib remains unusual. There are no accompanying artifacts, no inscriptions, no clear indications of ritual activity. The wall stands alone, without context, without explanation. It does not point to a specific belief system or cultural practice. It exists, but it does not communicate. And that silence is perhaps its most defining feature, because despite its size, despite its persistence across the landscape, the wall does not tell a story. It does not reveal its purpose. It does not offer clues that lead to understanding. It simply continues, segment after segment, across terrain that offers no answers. Modern technology has allowed researchers to study the wall from above, using aerial photography and satellite imagery to trace its full extent. These methods have revealed patterns that are not visible from the ground. The way the wall shifts direction, the way it interacts with the terrain, the way it seems to follow certain alignments in some areas while ignoring them in others. But even with this broader perspective, the fundamental question remains unchanged. Why was it built? Some have proposed that the wall may be part of a larger, unseen system, that what we see on the surface is only a fragment of a more complex network. Perhaps there were structures that have not survived, elements that have been lost to time, or connections that are no longer visible. It is a possibility, but one that relies heavily on what is not there. And absence is a difficult foundation for certainty. There is also the question of time. Dating the wall has proven challenging. Without clear artifacts or inscriptions, establishing a precise period of construction is difficult. Estimates place it somewhere within the first millennium BC, but even that is uncertain. It could be older, it could be newer. The lack of definitive dating adds another layer of ambiguity to an already complex puzzle, because without knowing when it was built, it becomes even harder to understand why. Different periods bring different contexts, different needs, different technologies, different cultural practices. Without a clear temporal anchor, the wall floats in history without a fixed point of reference, and so it remains, a structure that stretches across the desert, visible yet unexplained, not hidden, but not understood, not grand, but not insignificant. It does not demand attention, but it resists dismissal. It is simply there. And perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling. Because most mysteries invite investigation. They offer clues, patterns, or anomalies that suggest a path toward resolution. They challenge us, but they also guide us. The Khat Shabib does not guide. It does not point. It does not reveal. It exists without explanation, and in doing so, it forces a different kind of question. Not what it is, but whether we are asking the right questions at all. Because sometimes the problem is not that we lack answers, it is that we may not yet understand the question, and until we do, the wall will remain what it has always been, a line across the desert that leads nowhere, and perhaps everywhere at once. In 1909, a story emerged from one of the most heavily studied landscapes in the world, a place where every layer of rock had been analyzed, every formation mapped, and every theory debated. The Grand Canyon, vast and ancient, had long been considered a geological record of time itself. But that year, something surfaced that did not belong to geology. It belonged to history. Or at least, it claimed to. The report came from a man named G.E. Kincaid, an explorer and amateur archaeologist who claimed to have made a discovery deep within the canyon's walls. According to his account, he had been navigating the Colorado River when he noticed something unusual high above the waterline. An opening in the rock, positioned in a way that suggested it was not entirely natural. Curiosity led him upward, climbing toward what he believed might be a cave. What he found, if his account is to be believed, was not a cave in the conventional sense. It was a system, a network of chambers carved into the rock, extending deep into the canyon. Not random cavities formed by erosion, but structured spaces, organized, intentional. Inside these chambers, Kincaid claimed to have discovered artifacts that defied expectation. Objects made of metal, tools that appeared manufactured, and most strikingly, statues and inscriptions that bore resemblance to ancient Egyptian and Asian cultures. He described figures seated in positions that echoed known iconography from distant civilizations. He spoke of hieroglyph-like markings etched into the walls. He even reported finding mummified remains, preserved in ways that suggested deliberate burial practices. If true, the implications would be extraordinary, because it would mean that a complex, possibly advanced civilization existed within the Grand Canyon long before the known Native American cultures of the region. It would suggest contact between continents across vast distances, or the presence of a previously unknown culture with its own unique development. It would challenge the established timeline of human migration into North America. It would require a re-evaluation of history itself. But that is only if it were true. Kincaid's account was published in a newspaper, which at the time was a common way for discoveries to be shared with the public. The article described the find in detail, presenting it as a significant archaeological breakthrough. It even mentioned that the Smithsonian Institution had taken interest and would be involved in further investigation. And then, nothing. No follow-up expedition. No official confirmation. No additional reports. The story simply stopped. At first, this could be explained as a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. Early reports often contained inaccuracies. Explorers sometimes misinterpreted what they saw or embellished details to capture attention. Without verification, such accounts could not be treated as reliable evidence. But what makes this case different is not just the claim itself, but what did not happen afterward. Because in a field where even minor discoveries are documented, studied, and debated extensively, a claim of this magnitude should have triggered immediate and sustained investigation. The Grand Canyon was not an inaccessible or unknown region. It was already the focus of scientific interest. Any credible report of artificial structures or foreign artifacts would have been pursued aggressively. Yet there is no record of such pursuit. No official documentation from the Smithsonian confirming involvement. No archaeological team sent to verify the location. No recovered artifacts cataloged or displayed. No academic papers analyzing the findings. It is as if the discovery was acknowledged briefly and then ignored entirely, which raises a difficult question. Why? One possibility is that the story was not credible to begin with, that Kincaid's account was either mistaken or fabricated, and that those in positions of authority recognized this and chose not to pursue it further. In this scenario, the lack of follow-up is not mysterious, but practical. Resources were not allocated because there was no reason to believe the claim warranted investigation. This explanation is consistent with standard scientific practice. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and without such evidence, they are often set aside. But there is a complication, because the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and in this case, the absence is unusually complete. There are no partial confirmations, no minor findings that align with the description, no independent accounts that support or even partially corroborate the story. It is not just that the discovery was not verified, it is that it left no trace of having been investigated at all. Which leads to a second possibility, that the discovery was investigated but the results were not made public. This idea introduces the concept of suppression, a term that must be approached with caution. It suggests that information was deliberately withheld, that findings were concealed to prevent disruption of established narratives or to control the interpretation of history. Such claims are difficult to prove, and often rely on the absence of information rather than its presence. Without documentation, it becomes impossible to distinguish between intentional concealment and simple non-existence. Still, the pattern invites consideration. A discovery is reported, it attracts attention, it implies significant consequences, and then it disappears from the record. No confirmation, no refutation, just silence. There is also the possibility that the location described by Kincaid was never rediscovered. The Grand Canyon is vast, with countless caves and formations that are difficult to access. It is conceivable that the exact site, if it existed, was lost, misidentified, or simply not found again. But this explanation raises its own questions, because Kincaid's account included specific details about the location, the structure of the chambers, and the nature of the artifacts. If the discovery had any basis in reality, even partial, one might expect that subsequent explorations would have encountered at least some corresponding evidence. Yet none has been documented. Modern exploration of the Grand Canyon has been extensive. Researchers have mapped caves, studied geological formations, and conducted archaeological surveys across the region. While many discoveries have been made, none align with the description provided in the 1909 report. No artificial chambers of the type described. No foreign artifacts embedded within the canyon walls. No mummified remains matching the account. Which brings the focus back to the original report. If it was accurate, then something prevented its verification. If it was inaccurate, then something allowed it to be published as credible information. Either way, it occupies a space that is difficult to categorize, not fully accepted, not entirely dismissed. It exists as a possibility that cannot be resolved with the available evidence. And that unresolved state is what sustains its presence in discussion, because it touches on a broader question about how knowledge is constructed. What is accepted as history is not only based on what is discovered, but also on what is verified, documented, and integrated into existing frameworks. Discoveries that do not fit are either reinterpreted or excluded. This process is necessary for maintaining coherence, but it also means that anomalies can be overlooked or set aside. The Kincaid account represents such an anomaly. It does not fit. It does not align with established timelines or cultural developments, and without evidence, it cannot be incorporated. But it also cannot be entirely erased, because it was recorded, published, and circulated. It remains as a fragment, a report without resolution, a claim without confirmation, a discovery that was never followed, and perhaps that is where its significance lies, not in what it proves, but in what it suggests. That there are moments in the historical record where something appears, briefly, that does not align with what we understand, moments that are not fully explored, not fully explored, not fully explained, and not fully forgotten. They remain at the edges, not central, not dominant, but present. And they invite a different kind of inquiry, not one that seeks immediate answers, but one that recognizes the limits of current understanding. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are not the ones that are confirmed, but the ones that leave behind just enough information to remind us that there may be more. More beneath the surface, more within the gaps, more in the silence that follows a story that was never continued. And the question that lingers is not whether the discovery was real, but what would it mean if it was? In the far south of Chile, where dense forests meet cold rivers and the land still feels largely untouched by time, there exists an archaeological site that quietly altered one of the most fundamental assumptions about human history. It is not a towering monument or a grand structure carved in stone. It is something far more subtle. A layer in the earth. A trace of something that happened long ago, buried beneath centuries of natural change. This place is known as Monteverde. At first, Monteverde did not seem extraordinary. It was simply another site among many where archaeologists searched for evidence of early human activity. But as excavations began in the 1970s, what researchers uncovered challenged the established timeline of human migration into the Americas. For decades, the dominant theory held that the first humans arrived via the Bering Land Bridge around 13,000 years ago. This model was widely accepted, supported by numerous sites across North America. Monteverde did not fit that model. The evidence found there suggested human presence as early as 14,500 years ago, possibly even earlier. This meant that people were living at the southern tip of South America long before they were supposed to have arrived. It forced a re-evaluation of migration patterns, travel routes, and the adaptability of early human populations. But even this significant shift in understanding was not the most puzzling aspect of the site. That distinction belongs to something far less obvious, but far more difficult to explain. Beneath the layers of soil and organic material, researchers discovered what has come to be known as the burn layer. At a depth of approximately 1.5 meters below the surface, there exists a distinct stratum of charred material. It is not scattered or localized. It is widespread, consistent. A clear indication that, at some point in the distant past, a large area experienced intense burning. At first glance, this might not seem unusual. Fires occur naturally. Lightning strikes can ignite vegetation. Dry conditions can allow flames to spread rapidly. In many environments, fire is a regular and even necessary part of ecological cycles. But Monteverde is not a typical environment for such events. The region is wet, dense with vegetation, not prone to the kind of dry conditions that support large-scale natural fires. And more importantly, the burn layer does not behave like the result of a natural wildfire. It is too uniform, too controlled, too deliberate. And that is where the questions begin. Because if this was not a natural fire, then it was likely caused by human activity, which leads to a simple but unsettling possibility, that early humans at Monteverde intentionally burned the landscape. But why? One explanation is practical. Fire can be used to clear land, manage vegetation, and create favorable conditions for hunting or habitation. Many indigenous cultures have used controlled burns as a tool for shaping their environment. It is an effective method, requiring relatively simple technology but producing significant results. This theory suggests that the inhabitants of Monteverde were not just passive occupants of the land, but active managers of it. That they understood how to use fire strategically, shaping their surroundings to meet their needs. It is a compelling idea, but it does not fully explain the scale of the burn layer, because the evidence suggests something more extensive than localized land management. The burning appears to have affected a broad area, beyond what would be necessary for simple clearing or maintenance. It is not a small, controlled burn, it is something larger, and that raises another possibility, that the fire was not entirely controlled, that it may have started intentionally but spread beyond its intended boundaries. That early humans experimenting with fire may have triggered an event that grew beyond their ability to manage. This is plausible. Fire is unpredictable, especially in environments where conditions can change rapidly. A controlled burn can become a wildfire if circumstances shift. But again, the characteristics of the burn layer complicate this explanation. The consistency of the charred material suggests a level of uniformity that is difficult to reconcile with an uncontrolled event. Wildfires tend to leave uneven patterns influenced by wind, terrain, and available fuel. They create variation, not consistency. And Monteverde's burn layer does not show that variation. It appears intentional, which leads to a more complex question. What if the fire was not just a tool, but a response? Some researchers have considered the possibility that the burn layer represents a reaction to an external event, that something occurred which required or resulted in widespread burning. This could include environmental changes, the arrival of new populations, or even conflict. The idea of conflict is difficult to support directly, as there is no clear evidence of violence at the site. No weapons embedded in remains, no signs of organized warfare. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in environments where preservation conditions are variable. Still, without supporting data, this theory remains speculative. There is another possibility, one that shifts the focus away from human intention entirely. That the burn layer is the result of a natural event, but not a typical one. Some have proposed that it could be linked to a larger environmental phenomenon, such as a volcanic eruption or a meteorite impact. Events of this scale can produce widespread burning, leaving behind layers of charred material that resemble those found at Monteverde. But here again the evidence is inconclusive. There are no clear indicators of volcanic activity corresponding to the time period in question. No ash layers, no geological markers that would support such an event. Similarly, there is no confirmed evidence of an impact event that would align with the characteristics of the burn layer, which brings the focus back to human activity, but not in the simple sense of fire as a tool. Rather, in the possibility that early humans at Monteverde were engaging in behaviors that we do not fully understand, because the site itself already challenges assumptions about human capability and movement. The people who lived there arrived earlier than expected, adapted to a challenging environment, and left behind evidence of a level of organization that was not previously associated with such early populations. The burn layer adds another dimension to that complexity. It suggests that these early inhabitants were not only present, but active in ways that extend beyond basic survival. They were shaping their environment, altering it, possibly on a scale that we have not fully appreciated. And yet, the purpose of that alteration remains unclear. There are no written records, no direct accounts, only the physical evidence embedded in the earth, waiting to be interpreted. And interpretation is where uncertainty enters. Because without context, evidence can lead to multiple conclusions, each plausible, each incomplete, each dependent on assumptions about how early humans behaved. And those assumptions are precisely what Monteverde challenges, because it shows that early human societies may have been more complex, more adaptable, and more capable than previously believed. The burn layer is not just a mystery of fire, it is a reflection of that broader complexity, a reminder that even the most fundamental aspects of human history, when we arrived, how we lived, what we were capable of, are still subject to revision. And that revision often begins with something small, a layer in the soil, a trace of carbon, a pattern that does not fit. From a distance, it is easy to overlook, to see it as just another feature of the landscape. But up close, it reveals something else, a moment, an event, a decision, something that happened thousands of years ago, preserved not in words, but in material. And that material raises a question that has not yet been answered. Was this fire an accident, a tool, or something else entirely? Because until that question is resolved, the burn layer remains what it has always been, a mark in the earth that should not be there, and a reminder that even in places we believe we understand, there are still elements that resist explanation. Not because they are hidden, but because we do not yet know how to read them. In the quiet hills of the Republic of Georgia, far from the deserts of Africa where the story of human evolution is traditionally rooted, there exists a site that has forced scientists to reconsider what it means to be human. It is not a place that immediately captures attention. There are no towering monuments, no elaborate structures, no obvious signs of significance. At first glance, it appears ordinary, but beneath the surface, something was uncovered that does not fit neatly into the story we thought we understood. This place is known as Dmanisi. When excavations began in the late 20th century, researchers were not expecting to find anything that would challenge the foundations of anthropology. The site had already produced animal remains and simple tools suggesting early human activity. But what was discovered next changed everything. Human skulls, several of them, preserved remarkably well. At first, this seemed like a valuable but straightforward addition to the fossil record. Early human remains are rare, and each new discovery helps fill gaps in our understanding of how our species evolved. But as the skulls were examined more closely, it became clear that these were not ordinary finds. They did not match, not in the way they should. According to established models, early human evolution followed a relatively structured path. Species emerged, developed certain traits, and then gave rise to new species over time. While variation existed, it was generally within predictable limits. Different species could be distinguished based on consistent anatomical features, but the skulls from Dmanisi refused to conform to those expectations. Some were small, with features that resembled earlier human ancestors, such as Homo habilis. Others were larger, more robust, displaying characteristics associated with Homo erectus. The differences were not subtle, they were significant. Enough to suggest, at first glance, that they belonged to entirely different species. And yet, they were found in the same place, in the same layer of sediment, dating to the same time period, approximately 1.8 million years ago. This is where the problem begins. Because if these skulls represent different species, then those species coexisted in the same location at the same time. This challenges the linear model of evolution, where one species gradually replaces another. It suggests a more complex scenario, where multiple human forms existed simultaneously, interacting in ways we do not fully understand. But there is another possibility, that these skulls do not represent different species at all, that they belong to a single population, exhibiting a range of variation far greater than previously recognized. If this is true, then the implications are profound, because it would mean that early humans were not as uniform as we thought, that the boundaries between species are less defined, that what we classify as separate categories may actually be part of a continuous spectrum. This idea has been both supported and contested within the scientific community. Some researchers argue that the variation seen at Dmanisi falls within the range of a single species, suggesting that Homo erectus was more diverse than previously believed. Others maintain that the differences are too significant to be explained by variation alone, and that multiple species must be represented. The debate is ongoing, but regardless of which interpretation is correct, the Dmanisi skulls have already altered the conversation, because they reveal something that is difficult to ignore, that our understanding of human evolution is not as fixed as we might like to believe, and that the story of how we became what we are may be more complicated than a simple progression. There is another layer to this discovery that adds to its significance: the location itself. Dmanisi is not in Africa, it is in Eurasia. And the age of the fossil suggests that early humans left Africa much earlier than previously thought. This challenges another long-standing assumption that the migration of humans out of Africa occurred later, after certain evolutionary developments had taken place. But the evidence at Dmanisi indicates that these early humans, with relatively simple tools and varied physical features, were already capable of moving across continents. They adapted to new environments. They survived in unfamiliar conditions. They spread farther than expected. This raises questions about what drove that movement. Was it necessity, opportunity, curiosity, or something else entirely? The tools found at the site are simple: stone implements, basic in design, lacking the sophistication seen in later periods. Yet they were sufficient. Sufficient for survival. Sufficient for adaptation, which suggests that early humans did not require advanced technology to expand their range. They required something else. Something less tangible: flexibility, resilience, the ability to operate within a range of conditions without needing to fundamentally change. And that ability may be reflected in the skulls themselves. The variation in size and shape could represent adaptation to different roles, environments, or developmental patterns within a single population. It could indicate that early human groups were not homogeneous, but composed of individuals with diverse characteristics. If so, then the concept of a single type of early human becomes less useful, and the idea of clear evolutionary stages becomes less defined. Instead, we are left with a more complex picture, one where evolution is not a straight line, but a network: branches that overlap, traits that appear and reappear, populations that diverge and converge. The Dmanisi skulls do not provide all the answers, but they do highlight the limitations of our current models. They show that classification, while necessary, is also a simplification, a way of organizing information that may not fully capture the reality of biological variation. There is also the question of identity, not in the modern sense, but in the context of what it means to belong to a species. If individuals within a single population can differ so significantly, then how do we define the boundaries of that population? At what point does variation become distinction? And who decides? These are not just scientific questions. They are philosophical ones. They touch on the nature of categories, the way we interpret differences, and the assumptions we bring to the study of the past. The Dmanisi site forces us to confront these questions, not because it provides clear answers, but because it exposes the uncertainty. It shows that the past is not always as orderly as we would like, that the processes that shaped our species were influenced by factors we are still trying to understand, and that the evidence we rely on is often incomplete: fragments of bone, layers of sediment, tools left behind. Each piece tells part of the story, but not the whole. And sometimes those pieces do not fit together in the way we expect. The skulls from Dmanisi are among the most complete early human fossils ever found. They offer a rare opportunity to study variation within a single site, to compare features directly, to test hypotheses about evolution and migration. But they also present a challenge, because they do not conform to established categories. They resist easy classification. They complicate the narrative. And in doing so, they remind us of something important: that science is not just about answers. It is about questions, about refining our understanding as new evidence emerges, about recognizing that certainty is often temporary, and that what we know today may be revised tomorrow. The Dmanisi skulls are not an anomaly to be explained away. They are a data point, a significant one, that must be integrated into the broader framework of human evolution. But integration requires adjustment. It requires flexibility, and sometimes it requires letting go of assumptions that no longer hold. In the end, the significance of Dmanisi is not just in what was found, but in what it forces us to reconsider: the timeline of human migration, the definition of species, the nature of variation, the structure of evolution itself. It is a reminder that the story of humanity is still being written, not in words, but in discoveries, each one adding complexity, each one introducing new questions, and each one bringing us closer to an understanding that may never be complete. because the deeper we look into our past, the more we realize that it is not a single path, but a series of overlapping journeys. And the skulls of Domanici are a record of one of those journeys. Not a clear one, not a simple one, but a real one. And that is enough to change everything. In one of the most isolated and inhospitable regions on Earth, where the air thins with altitude and the landscape feels untouched by time, there exists a discovery that has resisted explanation for decades. It is not hidden. It is not buried deep beneath layers of soil. It is visible, exposed along the sides of a mountain, embedded within rock that predates human history. And yet what appears there looks unmistakably artificial. This place is located near Mount Baigong, in the Qinghai Tibet Plateau of China, close to a remote body of water known as Tuosu Lake. The region itself is harsh and largely uninhabited, characterized by dry terrain, extreme temperatures, and minimal signs of human activity. It is not the kind of place where one would expect to find evidence of complex construction. And yet, along the slopes and within the caves of this mountain, there are formations that do not behave like natural rock. They resemble pipes, long cylindrical structures that extend through the stone, some measuring only a few centimeters in diameter, others significantly larger. They appear to emerge from the rock face, sometimes protruding outward, sometimes disappearing into the mountain itself. In certain areas, they branch, intersect, and run parallel to one another, forming patterns that seem too regular to be random. At first glance, the immediate assumption is that these formations are natural. Geological processes are capable of producing a wide range of structures, some of which can resemble artificial objects. Mineral deposits can form tubes. Erosion can shape rock in ways that appear deliberate. Over time, layers of sediment can harden and fracture, creating patterns that mimic design. But the Baigong pipes do not fit easily into these explanations. When researchers began to study them more closely, they found that the composition of the pipes differed from the surrounding rock. Analysis indicated that they contained a mixture of elements, including iron oxide and other minerals, in concentrations that suggested a level of organization not typically associated with random geological formation. This does not immediately imply artificial origin. Natural processes can produce complex chemical structures, but the consistency of the pipes, their shape, and their distribution raised questions, because they do not appear sporadic. They appear placed. Some of the pipes extend from the interior of caves, emerging from the walls as if they were part of a system embedded within the mountain. Others run along the exterior, following paths that seem to respond to the contours of the terrain. In certain sections, they appear to converge, as if connecting to a central point. These observations led to a range of interpretations. One of the earliest and most widely discussed theories was that the pipes were the result of a natural process known as biomineralization. This is a phenomenon in which biological organisms such as bacteria or plant roots influence the deposition of minerals over time. As these organisms grow and decay, they can leave behind tubular structures that, once mineralized, resemble pipes. This explanation has the advantage of being grounded in known processes. It does not require the introduction of unknown technologies or lost civilizations. It fits within the framework of geology and biology as currently understood, but it does not fully account for all the observed features. The scale of the pipes, their apparent organization, and their integration into the surrounding rock raise questions about whether biomineralization alone can produce such structures. While it can explain individual formations, it becomes more difficult to apply consistently across the entire site. Another possibility is that the pipes are the result of a process involving sedimentary structures, where layers of material formed around organic matter that later decomposed, leaving behind hollow or mineral-filled tubes. Over time, these could harden and become embedded within the rock. Again, this is plausible, but again, it does not resolve all inconsistencies. Because the pipes are not just isolated features, they appear in clusters, they follow patterns, and in some cases they extend in ways that suggest continuity rather than randomness. This has led to more unconventional interpretations, some that propose that the pipes are remnants of an ancient technological system, that they represent a form of infrastructure, perhaps related to water transport, ventilation, or some other function. This idea is based largely on the appearance of the structures, which resemble modern pipes in both form and arrangement. If this were true, it would imply the existence of a civilization with the capability to construct such systems in a region that shows no other signs of habitation. It would raise questions about who built them when they were built, and why no additional evidence of this civilization has been found. These are significant challenges, because the absence of supporting evidence makes it difficult to sustain such a theory within a scientific context. Archaeological discoveries are typically accompanied by a range of artifacts, tools, remains, structures that together form a coherent picture of human activity. At Baigong, no such context exists. There are no known settlements, no tools, no cultural artifacts, only the pipes. This isolation complicates interpretation, because without context, it becomes difficult to distinguish between natural anomaly and artificial construction. There is also the question of age. Some estimates suggest that the pipes could be extremely old, potentially predating known human activity in the region. If this is accurate, it would further challenge the idea of human construction, as it would place the formation of the pipes outside the timeline of established civilizations. But dating geological formations is complex, and estimates can vary depending on the methods used and the assumptions made, which leaves room for uncertainty. And where there is uncertainty, there is speculation. Among the more speculative theories is the idea that the pipes are evidence of a lost civilization, one that existed long before recorded history and left behind only fragments of its presence. This concept appears in various forms across different regions, often invoked to explain anomalies that do not fit within current frameworks. While intriguing, such theories face the same fundamental issue: lack of evidence. Without additional findings, without corroborating data, they remain possibilities rather than conclusions. There is also a more extreme interpretation, one that attributes the pipes to non-human origins. This idea suggests that the structures could be the result of extraterrestrial activity, remnants of technology not associated with any known human culture. This theory is not supported by scientific evidence and is generally not considered within academic discourse. It arises primarily from the appearance of the pipes and the difficulty in explaining them through conventional means. But it highlights an important point, that when something does not fit, the range of explanations expands, from the plausible to the improbable, from the grounded to the speculative. The Baigong pipes occupy a space where explanation is not straightforward. They are not easily dismissed as natural, but they are not convincingly artificial. They exist in a category that resists classification. And that resistance is what sustains interest, because they represent a gap, a point where observation does not align with expectation, and where understanding remains incomplete. Researchers continue to study the site, applying new techniques and revisiting old data. Advances in geological analysis may eventually provide more clarity. Improved dating methods could refine estimates of age. Comparative studies with similar formations elsewhere might reveal patterns that are not yet recognized. But for now, the pipes remain visible, unexplained, part of the landscape yet distinct from it. They do not move. They do not change. They simply persist. And in that persistence, they continue to raise the same question, not whether they are natural or artificial, but whether our current categories are sufficient to describe them. Because sometimes the issue is not the lack of an answer. It is the possibility that the answer does not fit within the options we are considering. And until a clearer explanation emerges, the Baigong pipes will remain what they have been since they were first noticed. A formation that should not exist, and a reminder that even in the most remote places, there are still features of our world that do not fully align with what we think we know. Long before the first known civilizations began carving structured writing into clay tablets and stone walls, before the emergence of recognizable alphabets or formal systems of communication, there existed something far more ambiguous. Not quite language, not quite art, but something in between. Something that suggests intention, repetition, and meaning, yet resists translation. In the region of southeastern Europe, along the banks of the Danube River, archaeologists uncovered artifacts belonging to a culture that predates many of the world's earliest known civilizations. This culture, known as Vinkut, existed between approximately 5700 and 4500 BC. It thrived long before the rise of Mesopotamia, before the earliest Egyptian dynasties and well before writing systems are generally believed to have developed. At first, the discoveries associated with the Venkata culture appeared consistent with what one might expect from a Neolithic society. Settlements, pottery, tools, and figurines, all indicative of a community with established practices and a degree of social organization. But among these findings were objects that did not fit comfortably within the expectations of the time. Small clay tablets, fragments of pottery, carved figurines, all bearing markings, not random scratches or decorative patterns but repeated symbols, geometric shapes arranged in sequences, lines, crosses, triangles, and abstract forms that appeared across multiple objects and sites, sometimes separated by significant distances. Individually, these markings might have been dismissed as simple decoration, but taken together, they form a pattern, a system, or at least something that resembles one. This is where the difficulty begins, because the presence of repeated symbols suggests intention. It implies that these markings were not arbitrary, but chosen, that they served a purpose beyond aesthetics, that they conveyed something, whether information, identity, or meaning. But what exactly that meaning was remains unknown. The Vinta symbols have been studied for decades, yet no definitive interpretation has been accepted. Some researchers have proposed that they represent an early form of writing, predating the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia by more than 1,000 years. If this were true, it would significantly alter our understanding of the origins of written communication. It would suggest that writing did not emerge in a single region, but may have developed independently in multiple locations. It would challenge the idea that Mesopotamia was the sole birthplace of writing, and it would place the Venkata culture in a position of unexpected significance within the history of human communication. But this interpretation is not universally accepted, because writing, as it is typically defined, involves more than repeated symbols. It requires structure, consistency, and the ability to represent language in a way that can be interpreted across contexts. It requires evidence of grammar, syntax, or at least a system that can be decoded. And the Venkata symbols do not provide that. They are consistent in form but not in arrangement. They appear in sequences, but those sequences do not follow a pattern that can be easily analyzed. There is no clear indication of direction, no identifiable repetition that suggests words or phrases, and no key that allows for translation. This has led many researchers to classify the symbols as proto-writing, a term used to describe systems that may represent an early stage in the development of writing, but do not yet meet the criteria of a full writing system. In this view, the Venkata symbols are not language, but a precursor to it, a way of marking objects, indicating ownership, or conveying limited information without the complexity of true written communication. This interpretation is more conservative. It fits within the existing framework of how writing is believed to have evolved. It allows for the presence of symbolic systems without requiring a complete reevaluation of historical timelines, but it also leaves questions unanswered, because the consistency and distribution of the symbols suggest a level of organization that goes beyond simple marking. They are not random, they are not isolated. They appear across multiple sites, on different types of objects, in ways that imply shared understanding. This raises the possibility that the symbols were part of a cultural system, not necessarily writing in the modern sense, but a method of communication that was understood within the community, a set of signs that carried meaning, even if that meaning is no longer accessible to us. There is also the question of context. The symbols are found on a variety of objects, including pottery and figurines. Some appear in locations that suggest they were meant to be seen, while others are placed in less visible areas. This variation implies that the symbols may have served different functions depending on their placement. On pottery, they could indicate ownership, origin, or contents. On figurines, they might carry symbolic or ritual significance. But without a way to interpret the symbols directly, these remain hypotheses. There is no definitive evidence linking the markings to specific meanings or uses. Another aspect that complicates interpretation is the lack of continuity. The Venkata eventually declined, and with it, the use of these symbols appears to have disappeared. There is no clear line connecting them to later writing systems, no transitional forms that show a progression from these markings to more structured scripts. This discontinuity makes it difficult to place the symbols within a broader narrative. If they represent an early form of writing, then that form did not survive. If they are proto-writing, then the transition to true writing occurred elsewhere, independently. In either case, the the symbols exist as an isolated phenomenon. A system that appeared, was used, and then banished. This isolation adds to their mystery, because it suggests that whatever meaning they held was specific to a particular time and place, that they were part of a cultural context that no longer exists, and that without that context, interpretation becomes increasingly difficult. Modern attempts to decode the symbols have been inconclusive. Various methods have been applied, including statistical analysis, pattern recognition, and comparisons with known scripts. Some researchers have claimed to identify patterns or structures, but these findings have not been widely accepted. The lack of a bilingual text-to-key that links the symbols to a known language remains a significant obstacle. Without such a reference, interpretation relies heavily on inference, and inference, in this case, is limited. There is also the risk of overinterpretation, of seeing patterns where none exist, of imposing meaning onto symbols that may not carry it in the way we expect. This is a common challenge in the study of ancient markings. The human tendency to find structure, to identify language, to seek meaning, can lead to conclusions that are not supported by evidence, and so caution is necessary. But caution does not eliminate curiosity. The Vinkita symbols continue to attract attention because they represent a possibility, not a confirmed one, but a plausible one. That complex systems of communication may have existed earlier than we thought. That human societies were capable of developing symbolic systems that approached writing, even if they did not fully achieve it, and that the history of communication is not as linear as it is often presented. Instead, it may be composed of multiple attempts, some successful, some abandoned, some lost. The symbols of the Venkat culture may be one of those attempts, a system that functioned within its context, served its purpose, and then disappeared, leaving behind only fragments, marks on clay, patterns without translation, a structure without explanation. They do not tell us what they mean. They do not reveal their purpose. They do not connect clearly to what came after, but they exist, and their existence raises a question that extends beyond their immediate context. How many other systems, ideas, or forms of communication have appeared in human history only to vanish without leaving a trace? How many have been used, understood, and then forgotten? And how many might still be waiting to be recognized, not because they are hidden, but because we do not yet know how to interpret them? The Vinkaya symbols are not just a mystery of the past. They are a reminder of the limits of interpretation, of the gap between evidence and understanding, and of the possibility that meaning can exist even when it cannot be read. Because sometimes the presence of a pattern is enough to suggest that something is there, even if we do not yet know what it is. Rising above the coastline of Rio de Janeiro, overlooking a landscape shaped by both natural force and human history, stands a massive granite formation known as Pedra de Gavia. It is one of the largest monolithic rocks in the world, towering over the surrounding terrain with a presence that feels both imposing and strangely deliberate. From a distance, it appears like any other natural formation, shaped over time by wind, water, and geological pressure. But as one moves closer, something begins to emerge on its surface that does not seem entirely natural. Etched into the face of the rock, high above the ground, are markings that have sparked debate for over a century. At first glance, they appear as irregular grooves, perhaps the result of erosion or natural fracturing. But with closer inspection, certain patterns begin to take shape. Lines intersect at angles that seem intentional. Curves form shapes that resemble symbols. And in one particular section, there is what many interpret as the outline of a human face. This combination of features has led to one of the most persistent and controversial questions associated with the site. Are these markings natural, or were they created by human hands? The answer is not straightforward. Those who argue for a natural origin point to the processes that shape granite over long periods of time. Erosion, especially in coastal environments, can produce patterns that mimic deliberate carving. Wind, rain, and temperature fluctuations can create cracks and grooves that, under certain conditions, align in ways that appear structured. The human brain, predisposed to recognize patterns and faces, can interpret these formations as intentional even when they are not. This phenomenon is well documented. It is known as pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful images in random patterns. It explains why we see faces in clouds, shapes in shadows, and structure in chaos. Applied to Pedra da Gavea, it suggests that the markings are a coincidence, a natural formation that only appears significant because of how we interpret it. This explanation is widely accepted within the scientific community. It is consistent with known geological processes. It does not require the introduction of unknown cultures or undocumented events. It fits within the framework of what we understand about the natural world. But it does not fully satisfy everyone, because there are aspects of the markings that resist easy dismissal. The lines in certain areas appear too straight, the intersections too precise, the arrangement too consistent, and then there is the face. It is not detailed, but it is distinct enough that multiple observers independently have identified it. A broad forehead, a defined nose, a suggestion of eyes and mouth. It is not a perfect representation, but it is recognizable. This has led some to propose that the markings are not entirely natural, that at some point they were altered, enhanced, carved, not necessarily created from nothing, but modified from existing features to produce a specific image or set of symbols. If this is the case, then the next question becomes more complex. Who would have done this, and when? One of the earliest and most controversial theories suggests that the inscription may be linked to ancient Phoenician explorers. The Phoenicians, known for their maritime capabilities, traveled extensively across the Mediterranean and beyond. Some researchers have proposed that they may have reached the Americas long before the arrival of Europeans, leaving behind traces of their presence. This theory is based in part on interpretations of the markings as resembling Phoenician script. Certain lines and shapes have been compared to known characters, and attempts have been made to translate the inscription accordingly. These translations, however, vary widely and are not supported by consensus. The primary issue with this theory is the lack of corroborating evidence. There are no confirmed Phoenician artifacts found in Brazil, no settlements, no tools, no structures that can be reliably linked to their presence. Without such evidence, the idea remains speculative. It introduces a possibility, but does not establish it. Another theory proposes that the markings are the result of indigenous activity, that the local populations, long before European contact, may have carved symbols or images into the rock as part of their cultural or spiritual practices. This is a more grounded explanation. Indigenous cultures across the world have created rock art, carvings, and inscriptions as part of their interaction with the landscape. These markings often carry symbolic meaning, representing beliefs, stories, or identities. But here again, there are challenges. The style of the markings at Pedra da Gavea does not clearly align with known indigenous art forms from the region. The scale is also unusual. The location of the inscription, high on the rock face, would have made access difficult, requiring effort and tools that are not typically associated with such practices. And once again, there is a lack of supporting context. No nearby sites with similar markings. No artifacts that connect the inscription to a specific cultural group. No oral traditions that reference its creation, which brings the focus back to the markings themselves. Because regardless of their origin, they exist, they are visible, they can be studied, but they cannot be definitively explained. Modern analysis has attempted to approach the problem from a geological perspective, by examining the composition of the rock, the depth of the grooves, and the patterns of erosion. Researchers aim to determine whether the markings are consistent with natural processes or human intervention. These studies have generally supported the natural origin theory. The grooves align with known patterns of weathering. The rock shows no clear signs of tool use. The formation of the face can be explained through differential erosion, where softer areas of the rock wear away faster, leaving behind shapes that appear structured. But even with this analysis, the debate persists. Because interpretation is influenced not only by data, but by perspective. Those who approach the site expecting natural formations are more likely to see them. Those who approach it with the possibility of human involvement are more likely to question the conclusions. And in the absence of definitive evidence, both perspectives remain. There is also the question of significance. Even if the markings are natural, the attention they have received has transformed them into something more than just geological features. They have become part of a narrative, a point of curiosity, a subject of investigation. They represent the intersection of observation and interpretation, of what is seen and what is inferred, and in that intersection, meaning is constructed, not necessarily from the object itself, but from the way it is perceived. This is not unique to Pedro de Gavia. Similar debates have occurred around other formations, where natural features resemble artificial ones. In each case, the challenge is the same: to distinguish between what is there and what we think is there, to separate pattern from intention, to evaluate evidence without imposing expectation. But this is not always straightforward, because the human mind is not neutral. It seeks meaning. It looks for structure. It connects points, and when faced with ambiguity, it fills in the gaps. The inscription on Pedro de Gavia exists within that ambiguity. It is not clearly artificial, but it is not entirely unremarkable. It occupies a space where explanation is possible but not definitive, and that space allows for continued discussion, continued analysis, continued uncertainty. Perhaps in time, more advanced techniques will provide clearer answers, more precise measurements, more detailed comparisons, a better understanding of the processes that shaped the rock. Or perhaps new discoveries will emerge that provide context, additional sites, related markings, evidence that connects the inscription to a broader pattern. But until that happens, the markings remain as they are: visible, unresolved, part of the landscape yet distinct from it. They do not confirm a hidden history, but they do not entirely dismiss the possibility either. They simply exist, and in that existence they continue to raise a question that has yet to be fully answered, not whether they were carved, but whether we are seeing them clearly at all. Because sometimes the challenge is not in what is present, but in how we interpret it, and whether our interpretations reflect reality, or the patterns we expect to find. Hidden deep within a narrow canyon in what is now West Texas, far from modern cities and shielded by rugged terrain, there exists a piece of ancient art that does not behave like art is supposed to. It does not present a single clear image. It does not tell one simple story, and it does not remain confined to a single moment in time. Instead, it shifts, layers, and conceals parts of itself in ways that suggest something far more complex than a static painting. This is the White Shaman mural. At first glance, it appears to be a long stretch of painted figures extending across a rock face. The colors red, yellow, black, and white have faded with time, but the forms remain visible. Human-like shapes, animals, abstract patterns, and a central figure that stands out from the rest. This central figure, often referred to as the White Shaman, is larger, more defined, and positioned in a way that suggests importance. It would be easy to interpret this as a ritual scene, a depiction of a ceremony, a spiritual journey, or a mythological narrative. Such interpretations are common in the study of ancient rock art, where images often carry symbolic meaning tied to belief systems that are no longer fully understood. But the White Shaman mural does not settle into a single interpretation, because what is visible on the surface is only part of the story. As researchers began to study the mural more closely, using techniques that allow for the detection of pigments beneath the visible layer, they discovered something unexpected. There are multiple layers of artwork, some hidden beneath others, some partially erased, and some only visible under specific conditions. This means that the mural was not created at a single point in time. It was added to, modified, worked, possibly over generations. And that changes how it must be understood, because instead of a single act of creation, the mural represents a process, an ongoing interaction between people and place. A sequence of decisions made by different individuals at different times, each contributing to something that was never fully completed. This raises an immediate question: why would a piece of art be altered in this way? In many cultures, once a work is finished, it is preserved. Changes are minimal, and the original form is maintained as much as possible. But here, the original form is not preserved. It is built upon, covered, and in some cases, intentionally obscured. One explanation is that the mural was not meant to be permanent in the way we think of permanence, that it was part of a living tradition, a space where new elements could be added as beliefs evolved, as stories changed, or as new generations sought to reinterpret what came before. In this view, the mural is not a finished product, but a record of ongoing activity, a visual archive of cultural expression. But this explanation introduces its own complexity. Because if the mural was continuously updated, then the meanings of its symbols may have changed over time. What one group intended may not align with what another understood. Layers may represent different interpretations, different purposes, or even different systems of belief. This makes interpretation difficult, because it is not enough to analyze the visible layer. One must consider what lies beneath it, and what that underlying imagery might have meant at the time it was created. Researchers have attempted to reconstruct these layers using digital imaging and pigment analysis to identify patterns and sequences. In some cases, they have been able to isolate earlier forms, revealing figures and symbols that are no longer visible to the naked eye. These findings suggest that the mural contains multiple narratives, not just one story, but several, interwoven, overlapping, and not always consistent with each other. This raises the possibility that the mural served more than one function. It may have been a site of ritual activity, where images were created as part of ceremonies or spiritual practices. It may have been a teaching tool, used to convey knowledge or beliefs across generations. Or it may have been something else entirely, a space where meaning was not fixed, but fluid. There is also the question of the central figure, the white shaman. This figure is often interpreted as a representation of a spiritual leader, a guide, or a mediator between worlds. The elongated form, the distinctive coloring, and the position within the mural all suggest importance. But even this interpretation is not definitive, because the figure itself may have changed over time. Earlier layers may depict it differently, later editions may alter its meaning, and without a clear sequence of creation, it becomes difficult to determine which version reflects the original intent. Some researchers have proposed that the mural represents a form of cosmology, a visual map of the universe as understood by the people who created it. The arrangement of figures, the patterns, and the relationships between elements could reflect beliefs about the structure of the world, the movement of celestial bodies, or the connection between the physical and spiritual realms. This interpretation is supported by the complexity of the imagery, but it is not universally accepted, because once again, the lack of direct evidence limits certainty. There are no written records, no accompanying texts, no explanations left behind by the creators, only the mural itself, and the challenge of interpreting it without imposing external frameworks. There is also the possibility that some elements of the mural were intentionally concealed, that certain images were covered not by accident, but by design. This could suggest that the mural contained layers of meaning, some of which were not meant to be visible to everyone. Perhaps certain symbols were reserved for specific individuals, certain narratives accessible only to those with particular knowledge. If this is the case, then the mural may function not just as a public display, but as a selective one, a space where meaning is controlled, where visibility is intentional, and where interpretation depends on perspective. This idea aligns with practices observed in other cultures, where knowledge is distributed unevenly, and where access to certain information is restricted. But again, without direct evidence, it remains a possibility rather than a conclusion. What is clear is that the white shaman mural does not conform to simple explanations. It is not a single image. It is not a fixed narrative. It is not a completed work. It is a structure of layers, a sequence of actions, a record of interaction, and that makes it difficult to define, because it exists somewhere between art and process, between expression and modification, between what was created and what was changed. Modern efforts to preserve the mural have focused on documentation and analysis. High-resolution imaging, pigment sampling, and digital reconstruction have all been used to capture its current state and explore its history. These methods have provided valuable insights, but they also highlight the limitations of what can be known, because even with advanced technology, interpretation remains uncertain. The data can show what is there, but it cannot fully explain why, and that is where the mystery remains, not in the visibility of the mural, but in its meaning, in the decisions that led to its creation, in the reasons it was altered, and in the possibility that it was never intended to be finished at all. Because if the mural was meant to evolve, then its incomplete state is not a flaw. It is a feature, a reflection of a process that does not have a defined end, and that challenges the way we think about art, history, and meaning. It suggests that some creations are not meant to be preserved in a single form, but to change, to adapt, to be reinterpreted over time. The White Shaman mural is not just a painting, it is a record of change, a sequence without a final frame, and a reminder that not all stories are meant to be completed. Some are meant to remain open, not because they are unfinished, but because they were never meant to end. In a remote region of China, far from the centers of ancient imperial power, and buried beneath layers of soil that have preserved secrets for thousands of years, archaeologists uncovered a tomb that does not behave the way a tomb should. It does not follow the patterns expected of its time. It does not reflect the customs that defined burial practices for centuries, and perhaps most unsettling of all, it seems to contradict itself at every level. The discovery was made in Yongshan County, where a series of excavations revealed burial sites dating back roughly 2,500 years. This period, known as the Warring States era, was marked by political fragmentation, conflict, and rapid cultural development. Burial practices during this time were not random. They followed established traditions, often reflecting the status, identity, and beliefs of the individual interred. Tombs were carefully constructed. Grave goods were deliberately placed. Objects of value, tools, ornaments, and symbolic items were included to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Even in cases of modest burials, there was a consistency to the process, a structure, a logic. But this tomb does not follow that logic. At its center was a human body, positioned in a way that did not suggest ceremony, not arranged with care, but placed, almost as if the act of burial was completed without the attention typically given to such rituals. And then there was the mask, a bronze mask intricately crafted, covering the face of the deceased. It is this object that transforms the burial from unusual to deeply puzzling, because the mask itself is not ordinary. It is detailed, deliberate. Its features are exaggerated, almost stylized, with prominent eyes and a rigid expression that does not resemble a natural human face. It appears symbolic, possibly representing something beyond the individual it was placed upon. Masks of this type have been found in other parts of China, often associated with ritual practices or spiritual beliefs. They are sometimes linked to the idea of transformation, serving as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, or as a means of protecting the soul during its journey after death. But in those cases, the masks are part of a larger context. They are accompanied by other objects, other indicators of status or ritual significance. Here, there is nothing else. No weapons, no pottery, no jade, no ornaments, no signs of wealth or social standing, just the body and the mask. This absence is not a minor detail, it is central to the mystery. Because in ancient Chinese burial traditions, the inclusion of grave goods was not optional, it was essential. Even individuals of lower status were typically buried with items that reflected their role in life or their needs in the afterlife. The complete absence of such items suggests one of two things. Either the individual held no status at all, or the burial was intentionally stripped of its usual elements. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying, because if the individual was of low status, why include such a sophisticated and carefully crafted mask? And if the burial was intentionally minimal, why include the mask at all? This contradiction lies at the heart of the mystery. The mask suggests significance. The absence of other items suggests the opposite, and the two do not reconcile easily. One possible explanation is that the individual held a specific role that did not conform to typical social hierarchies. Perhaps a ritual specialist, a shaman, someone whose identity was defined not by wealth or power, but by function. In some cultures, individuals with spiritual roles are buried differently from others. Their graves may lack material wealth, reflecting a separation from worldly concerns, but include symbolic items related to their role. The mask could serve such a purpose, representing transformation, connection, or protection. But again, there is no direct evidence to support this interpretation. No inscriptions, no accompanying objects that would confirm such a role. Only the mask itself. Another possibility is that the burial represents a form of punishment or exclusion, that the individual was denied the full rites of burial, perhaps due to some transgression, but was still given the mask for reasons that are not immediately clear. This idea is difficult to evaluate, because while there are historical examples of individuals being denied proper burial, the inclusion of a high-quality artifact in such a context is unusual. Punishment typically involves removal, not addition, and yet here we see both, the removal of expected elements and the inclusion of something unexpected. There is also the question of the mask's origin. Was it created specifically for this burial, or was it repurposed from another context? The craftsmanship suggests skill and intention. It is not a hastily made object. It required time, resources, and expertise, which implies that it was valued. But if it was valued, why is it the only item present? Why is it not part of a larger set? These questions extend beyond the individual burial. They point to a broader uncertainty about the cultural context in which this tomb was created, because while it is associated with the Warring States period, it does not align neatly with known practices from that time. It deviates, not dramatically, but enough to raise doubt. And in archaeology, deviation is significant. It suggests either variation within a culture or the presence of influences that are not fully understood. There is also the possibility that the burial represents a transitional moment, a point where practices were changing, where old traditions were being replaced or modified. The Warring States period was a time of upheaval. Political structures were shifting, cultural norms were evolving. In such an environment, it is possible that burial practices were not entirely consistent, that variations emerged as different regions or groups adapted to new conditions. If this is the case, then the tomb may be an example of that variation, a reflection of a moment in which established rules were no longer strictly followed. But even within transitional periods, certain patterns tend to persist. Core elements of ritual are often maintained, even as other aspects change. The complete absence of grave goods remains difficult to explain within this framework. Which brings us back to the mask, because regardless of the broader context, it is the most distinctive element of the burial. It defines the tomb, it shapes interpretation, and it resists simple explanation. Some researchers have suggested that the mask may represent an identity that is not tied to the individual, that it could symbolize a role, a concept, or a transformation that overrides personal identity. In this view, the person beneath the mask is less important than what the mask represents. The burial becomes less about the individual and more about the idea. But without additional evidence, this remains speculative. There is no way to confirm what the mask was intended to signify, no record of its meaning, no parallel example that provides clarity. And so the tomb remains what it is, a structure that does not conform, a burial that contradicts expectation, a combination of elements that do not align. It does not provide answers. It presents a problem, a set of observations that cannot be easily integrated into existing models, and that is what gives it significance. Because archaeology is not only about what is known, it is also about what does not fit, about the anomalies that challenge assumptions, the findings that require reconsideration, the evidence that suggests there is more to understand. The Yangshan burial is one such case. It does not rewrite history, but it complicates it. It introduces uncertainty, it highlights the limits of our current knowledge, and it reminds us that even in well-studied periods, there are still elements that remain unexplained. The body, the mask, the absence of everything else. Each component is clear, but together, they form something that is not, a puzzle without a clear solution, a question without a definitive answer. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to describe it. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder that not all parts of the past are fully accessible. Some remain incomplete, not because they are hidden, but because the context required to understand them has been lost, and in that absence, interpretation becomes an exercise in possibility, not certainty. The burial remains, The mask remains, the questions remain, and until new evidence emerges, they will continue to exist in that space between what is known and what is not, a space where explanation is possible, but never complete. In the early 16th century, during a time when much of the world was still being charted, explored, and gradually understood through fragmented voyages and incomplete records, a document surfaced that continues to challenge the boundaries of what should have been known at the time. It is not a structure buried in the earth or an artifact hidden in a remote location. It is a map, ink on parchment, lines and shapes meant to represent the world as it was understood centuries ago. But there is a problem. Parts of this map appear to show things that should not have been known when it was created. This is the Piri-Reis map. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri-Reis, the map is a compilation of earlier sources. According to inscriptions on the document itself, it was created using a variety of maps and charts, some of which are believed to have been much older. This in itself is not unusual. Cartographers often relied on previous knowledge, combining information from different sources to create more comprehensive representations. But what makes this map different is not the act of compilation. It is what appears on the map. The surviving portion, discovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, depicts parts of Europe, Africa, and the western coastline of the Atlantic. It includes a detailed representation of the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of South America. At first glance, this seems consistent with the knowledge available in the early 16th century, particularly following the voyages of Columbus and other explorers. But when examined more closely, certain features begin to raise questions. The coastline of South America appears with a level of detail that some researchers argue exceeds what would have been possible based on the known explorations of the time. The shapes, proportions, and alignments suggest a familiarity that does not align neatly with the limited data available in the early 1500s. Even more controversial is the interpretation of the southern portion of the map. Some have claimed that it depicts a landmass extending further south, possibly representing Antarctica. This interpretation suggests that the map shows the coastline of Antarctica without its ice cover, something that would not have been observable without modern technology. This claim has been widely debated and is not accepted within the mainstream academic community. Most researchers argue that the southern landmass is more likely a distorted representation of South America, extended and misaligned due to the limitations of early mapping techniques. Cartographers of the time often worked with incomplete data, leading to inaccuracies and distortions that are visible in many historical maps. This explanation is consistent with known practices. It does not require the introduction of advanced knowledge or lost civilizations. It fits within the context of early exploration and cartography, but the debate persists, because even if the Antarctic interpretation is set aside, the map still presents challenges. The level of detail in certain regions, the apparent accuracy of some coastlines, the suggestion that multiple advanced source maps were used in its creation. These elements raise questions about the origins of the information Piri-Reis relied upon. In his own notes, Piri-Reis mentions that he used approximately 20 different source maps, including some that he attributed to ancient origins. He refers to maps from the time of Alexander the Great, suggesting that some of the information may have been preserved and transmitted across centuries. If this is accurate, then the map is not just a product of its time, but a reflection of earlier knowledge. Knowledge that may have been more advanced than previously assumed. This does not necessarily imply anything extraordinary. Ancient civilizations were capable of significant achievements in navigation and cartography. The Greeks, for example, developed sophisticated methods for measuring the Earth and representing it on maps. It is possible that some of this knowledge was preserved, copied, and eventually incorporated into later works. But the question remains, how accurate were those earlier maps? And how much of that accuracy is reflected in the Piri-Reis map? There is also the issue of projection. Modern analysis has shown that parts of the map appear to align with specific types of map projections, some of which were not formally developed until much later. This has led to speculation that the map may be based on sources that used advanced methods of representation. However, this interpretation is not universally accepted. Projection analysis can be influenced by selective comparison, and similarities may be coincidental rather than intentional. Still, the presence of these alignments adds another layer of complexity, because it suggests that the map may not be entirely random in its construction. that there may be underlying principles guiding its design. Another aspect to consider is the nature of the map as a compilation. Piri Reis did not claim to have discovered the information himself. He gathered it, combined it, interpreted it. This means that the map reflects not only the knowledge of its creator, but also the knowledge of those who came before him, and that knowledge may have been uneven. Some regions may be based on direct observation, others on second-hand reports, others still on much older sources whose accuracy cannot be verified. This layered origin makes it difficult to assess the map as a single entity. It is not a snapshot, it is a collage, a combination of different perspectives, times, and levels of accuracy, which means that inconsistencies are to be expected, distortions are likely, and apparent anomalies may be the result of overlapping information rather than advanced knowledge. But even with these considerations, the map remains significant because it highlights the complexity of historical knowledge transmission. It shows that information does not move in a straight line. It is copied, modified, lost, rediscovered, and reinterpreted. Maps are not just representations of geography. They are records of what was known, what was believed, and what was assumed. The Piri Reis map captures a moment in that process, a point where different streams of information converge, some accurate, some not, some possibly derived from sources we no longer have access to. This raises a broader question. How much knowledge has been lost over time? How many maps, documents, and records have disappeared, leaving behind only fragments and later works? And how do those fragments influence our understanding of the past? The map does not provide clear answers. It does not confirm the existence of advanced ancient cartography beyond what is already known. But it does suggest that the history of mapping is more complex than a simple progression from ignorance to accuracy. It involves rediscovery, reconstruction, and sometimes the preservation of information that predates the context in which it appears. There is also the human element, the tendency to interpret, to find meaning, to connect patterns. Some interpretations of the Piri Reis map go beyond what the evidence supports, attributing to it levels of precision or knowledge that cannot be substantiated. Others dismiss it entirely as inaccurate or irrelevant. The reality likely lies somewhere in between. It is neither a perfect representation of the world nor a meaningless artifact. It is a document shaped by its sources, its creator, and the limitations of its time. And within that document, there are elements that invite further study. Not because they are inexplicable, but because they are not fully explained. The map remains a subject of interest not because it proves something extraordinary, but because it occupies a space where understanding is incomplete. It is a reminder that historical artifacts are not always straightforward, that they require careful analysis, context, and a willingness to consider multiple possibilities without jumping to conclusions. The Piri Reis map does not rewrite history, but it does complicate it. It introduces questions about the sources of knowledge, the transmission of information, and the accuracy of what was known at different points in time. It is not a mystery in the sense of being unsolvable, but it is unresolved, and in that unresolved state, it continues to draw attention, not as evidence of something hidden, but as an example of how much there is still to understand. Because sometimes the most interesting discoveries are not the ones that provide answers, but the ones that reveal the limits of what we know. And the Piri Reis map is one of those discoveries, a representation of the world that reflects not just geography, but the complexity of knowledge itself. In August of 1977, in a quiet region of Ohio, a radio telescope picked up something that, even decades later, remains one of the most puzzling signals ever recorded. It lasted only 72 seconds. It was never heard again. And yet, in that brief moment, it displayed characteristics that do not fit easily into any known explanation. This event has come to be known simply as the WOW signal. The name itself comes from the reaction of the astronomer who first noticed it. As the data was being reviewed, a sequence of numbers and letters stood out sharply against the background noise. It was unusually strong, highly structured, and unlike the typical signals the telescope was designed to detect. Next to the printout, the astronomer circled the sequence and wrote a single word: "Wow." At the time, The Big Ear radio telescope was part of a project focused on searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. It scanned the sky, listening for radio signals that might indicate the presence of non-natural sources. Most of what it detected was predictable cosmic noise, background radiation, signals that could be traced to known astronomical phenomena. But this signal was different. It appeared suddenly, reached a peak intensity, and then faded away in a pattern consistent with the movement of a source through the telescope's field of view. The frequency of the signal was particularly significant. It was very close to the hydrogen line, a specific radio frequency emitted by hydrogen atoms, which is considered a logical choice for interstellar communication due to its universal presence. This detail has been central to the discussion, because if a civilization were attempting to send a signal across space, choosing a frequency associated with hydrogen would make sense. It is a common reference point, recognizable to any technologically advanced observer. But the signal's origin was never confirmed. Despite repeated attempts to detect it again, using the same equipment and targeting the same region of the sky, no similar signal has been observed. This lack of repetition is one of the key challenges in interpreting the event. In science, repeatability is essential. A phenomenon that can be observed multiple times can be studied, analyzed, and understood. But a one-time event, no matter how unusual, is difficult to classify. It could be significant, or it could be an anomaly. One possibility is that the signal was of natural origin. There are various cosmic sources that emit radio waves, including pulsars, quasars, and other astronomical objects. Some of these can produce signals that appear structured or intense. However, the specific characteristics of the WOW signal, its narrow frequency band, its strength, and its sudden appearance do not match typical patterns associated with known natural sources. This does not rule out a natural explanation, but it does make it less straightforward. Another possibility is that the signal was of human origin. Radio interference from satellites, aircraft, or ground-based transmitters can sometimes produce unexpected results. Equipment errors, reflections, or overlapping signals can create patterns that appear unusual. But in this case, the signal did not match known sources of interference at the time. The frequency was not commonly used for terrestrial communication, and the direction from which the signal appeared to originate did not align with known transmitters. This reduces the likelihood of a simple explanation involving human technology. Still, it cannot be completely excluded. There is also the possibility that the signal was the result of a transient event, something that occurred briefly, produced a signal, and then ceased. This could include phenomena such as passing objects, temporary alignments, or events that do not repeat in predictable ways. But again, without additional data, this remains speculative. The most discussed interpretation, though not the most accepted, is that the signal may have originated from an intelligent source. Not necessarily extraterrestrial in the sense often portrayed in popular culture, but non-natural. A signal that was deliberately transmitted, structured, intentional. This idea is supported by certain features of the signal. Its narrow bandwidth suggests a focused transmission rather than a broad natural emission. Its strength indicates a significant source of energy, and its alignment with the hydrogen frequency adds to the sense of deliberate choice. But these features are not conclusive. They suggest possibility, not proof, and in the absence of repetition or additional evidence, the hypothesis cannot be confirmed. What makes the WOW signal particularly compelling is not just its characteristics, but its isolation. It stands alone, a single event in decades of observation, not part of a pattern, not connected to other signals. This isolation makes it difficult to place within any framework. It cannot be compared directly to similar events, because there are none that match it precisely. This leads to a situation where interpretation depends heavily on perspective. Those inclined toward natural explanations see it as an unusual but ultimately explainable event, one that fits within the broader range of cosmic variability. Those open to more speculative interpretations see it as a potential indicator of something beyond current understanding. But both perspectives face the same limitation: lack of data. The signal was recorded, it was analyzed, and then it was gone. No follow-up, no confirmation, no repetition. This has led to ongoing efforts to monitor the same region of the sky using more advanced equipment and more sensitive detection methods. modern radio telescopes have far greater capabilities than those available in 1977, allowing for more detailed observation and analysis. Yet, despite these advances, the signal has not reappeared. This absence raises another question. If the signal was intentional, why was it not repeated? Communication, by its nature, involves repetition. Signals are sent multiple times to ensure they are received and recognized. A single transmission, without follow-up, is not an effective method of communication, unless it was not intended as communication, but something else, a byproduct, an unintended emission, a signal that was not meant to be detected, but was. This possibility shifts the interpretation, from deliberate contact to incidental observation, from message to artifact. But again, without additional evidence, it remains a possibility rather than a conclusion. There have been attempts to identify potential sources within the region of the sky from which the signal appeared to originate. Various stars and celestial objects have been considered, including those with characteristics that might support the presence of planets. But no direct connection has been established. The region remains as it was, a point in space associated with a signal that occurred once, and only once. The wow signal does not provide answers. It provides a question, a single data point that does not fit easily into existing categories. It does not confirm the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but it does not entirely rule out the possibility either. It exists in a space between known and unknown, between explanation and uncertainty, and in that space it continues to be studied. Not because it is definitive, but because it is unresolved. It represents a moment where observation exceeded understanding, where data was recorded but meaning was not established, and that is not uncommon in science. There are many instances where phenomena are observed before they are understood, where patterns are recognized before their causes are identified. The difference here is that the opportunity for further observation has not presented itself. The signal did not repeat, and without repetition, analysis is limited. The wow signal remains what it was at the moment of its discovery, an unexpected event, a brief anomaly, a sequence of data that stands out from everything around it, and a reminder that even with advanced technology and systematic observation, there are still moments where something appears that does not immediately align with what we know. Not because it is beyond explanation, but because the explanation has not yet been found, or perhaps because the conditions required to observe it again have not occurred. Either way, the signal remains, not in the sky, but in the record. A single instance, 72 seconds, and a question that has yet to be answered. What was it? And will it ever happen again? In 1912, in a quiet corner of Italy, a man named Wilfred Voynich acquired a manuscript that would go on to become one of the most studied, analyzed, and ultimately unresolved documents in history. It was not large, not particularly ornate, and at first glance not obviously significant, but the moment it was opened it became clear that this was not an ordinary text, because nothing inside it made sense. The manuscript, now known as the Voynich manuscript, is written in a script that does not correspond to any known language. The characters are consistent, repeated across hundreds of pages, arranged in patterns that resemble words and sentences. There are paragraphs, sections, and what appear to be structured passages. But despite decades of effort, no one has been able to decipher it. Not linguists, not cryptographers, not historians, not even modern computational systems designed to analyze complex patterns. The text remains unreadable. At first, this might suggest a simple explanation. Perhaps the manuscript is a cipher, a coded message designed to conceal information. Ciphers have been used throughout history for communication, especially in contexts where secrecy was important. Given enough time and effort, most ciphers can be broken, especially with the analytical tools available today. But the Voynich manuscript does not behave like a typical cipher. In a conventional cipher, there is usually a consistent mapping between the encoded text and the original language. Patterns emerge. Frequencies can be analyzed. Repetition reveals structure. With enough data, the underlying system can be reconstructed. But in this case, those patterns do not resolve into anything recognizable. The text shows statistical properties similar to natural languages. Certain characters appear more frequently than others. Some combinations occur repeatedly, suggesting rules or structure. But these patterns do not align with any known linguistic system. It is as if the manuscript is written in a language that follows rules, but those rules do not correspond to any language we understand. This raises an immediate question. Is the text meaningful at all? One possibility is that the manuscript is a hoax, that it was created to appear complex and mysterious, without containing actual information. In this scenario, the text is not meant to be read, but to give the impression of depth. The illustrations, which include plants, astronomical diagrams, and human figures, add to this impression, suggesting a work of scientific or medical significance. But this explanation encounters a problem. Creating a text of this length and consistency, with patterns that mimic natural language, would require significant effort. It would not be a simple task to produce hundreds of pages of structured, non-random text without introducing detectable inconsistencies. Most known hoaxes do not operate at this level of complexity. And more importantly, there is no clear motive. Why create such a manuscript? For profit? For deception? For intellectual challenge? Without context, the purpose remains unclear. Another possibility is that the manuscript represents an unknown or lost language, that it was written in a system that has not survived, and therefore cannot be compared to existing linguistic frameworks. This would explain the inability to translate it, as there would be no reference point. But this theory also faces challenges. Languages, even when isolated, tend to share certain features. They have grammatical structures, recognizable patterns, and relationships between words. The Voynich text, while structured, does not clearly exhibit these features in a way that aligns with known linguistic behavior. It is consistent, but not interpretable. There is also the possibility that the manuscript is written in a constructed language, an artificial system designed by its creator, with its own rules and vocabulary. Constructed languages have been developed for various purposes, including secrecy, experimentation, or artistic expression. If the Voynich manuscript is written in such a language, then its meaning would be accessible only to those who understand the system. And if that system was never recorded elsewhere, it would remain inaccessible. This explanation is plausible, but it does not explain the illustrations. Because the manuscript is not just text, it contains drawings of plants that do not correspond to known species, diagrams that resemble astronomical charts, but do not match known constellations, figures that appear to be human, engaged in activities that are difficult to interpret. These images suggest that the manuscript is not purely abstract. It is attempting to represent something related to the natural world, or perhaps a version of it. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript is a form of encoded scientific or medical knowledge, that the plants represent herbal remedies, the diagrams reflect biological processes, and the text describes treatments or observations. If this is the case, then the manuscript could be a record of knowledge that has been deliberately concealed. But again, without a way to read the text, this remains speculative. There is also the question of origin. Radiocarbon dating of the parchment has placed the manuscript in the early 15th century. This provides a time frame, but not a location or a creator. The style of the illustration suggests a European origin, but this is not definitive. The manuscript has passed through several hands over the centuries, with records indicating ownership by scholars and collectors, but its original purpose and context remain unknown. This lack of provenance adds to the difficulty of interpretation, because without knowing who created it or why, it becomes harder to understand what it represents. Modern attempts to decode the manuscript have employed a range of techniques: statistical analysis, machine learning, comparative linguistics, pattern recognition. Each approach has yielded insights into the structure of the text, but none have produced a translation. Some studies have suggested that the text may be generated using a system that produces language-like patterns without conveying meaning. Others have proposed that it may encode information in ways that are not immediately apparent, such as through positional or visual cues, rather than direct translation. These theories highlight the complexity of the problem, because the manuscript does not simply resist translation, it resists classification. It does not fit neatly into any category, not a known language, not a standard cipher, not a simple hoax. It occupies a space that is difficult to define, and that is what sustains interest in it, because it represents a challenge, not just to decode a text, but to understand what kind of text it is, what system it follows, what purpose it serves, and whether it was ever intended to be understood by anyone other than its creator. There is also the possibility that the manuscript is meaningful in a way that does not rely on direct translation, that its significance lies not in the content of the text, but in the structure, the patterns, or the relationship between text and image. In this view, the manuscript is not a message to be decoded, but a system to be interpreted, a different kind of communication, one that does not align with conventional expectations. But without a framework for such interpretation, this idea remains abstract. The Voynich manuscript continues to be studied, not because it promises immediate answers, but because it represents a limit, a point where current methods of analysis reach their boundary, where data is available but meaning is not. And that boundary is important, because it defines the scope of what can be understood with existing tools, and suggests where new approaches may be needed. The manuscript does not reveal its secrets easily, or perhaps it does not reveal them at all. It remains as it has been for centuries, a collection of pages, filled with text that cannot be read, images that cannot be fully explained, and patterns that suggest meaning without confirming it. It is not hidden. It is not inaccessible. It is simply unresolved. And in that unresolved state, it continues to raise the same question, not what it says, but whether it was ever meant to be understood. Because sometimes the most complex codes are not the ones that are designed to be broken, but the ones that exist without a key and may never have had one to begin with. In 1901, off the coast of a small Greek island, a group of sponge divers made a discovery that, at the time, seemed like little more than a collection of corroded fragments. The wreck they had stumbled upon lay beneath the waters near Antikythera, an ancient ship resting on the seabed for over 2,000 years. Among statues, pottery, and other artifacts typical of ancient trade routes, there was something else, something that did not resemble anything expected from that era. At first, it appeared to be a lump of bronze and wood, heavily encrusted with mineral deposits, its original form obscured by centuries of corrosion. It was recovered along with the rest of the artifacts and transported to a museum, where it sat for some time before anyone realized what it actually was. Because when the outer layers were examined more closely, something unexpected began to emerge. Gears. Interlocking bronze gears. Small, precise, and arranged in a way that suggested intentional design. This object would later be known as the Antikythera mechanism, and it would become one of the most studied and debated artifacts in the history of archaeology, because it should not exist, not in the way it does, not at the time it was made. The mechanism dates to around the 2nd or 1st century BC. This places it firmly within the context of ancient Greek civilization, a period known for advances in philosophy, mathematics, and early scientific thought. But even within that context, the level of mechanical complexity displayed by this device is unexpected. The gears are not random, they are cut with precision. They mesh together in a system that allows for the transfer of motion, and when reconstructed, the device appears to function as a kind of analog computer. A machine capable of predicting astronomical events. It could track the movements of the sun and moon, predict lunar eclipses, possibly even model the cycles of known planets, all through a system of rotating gears, calibrated to represent time and celestial motion. This level of sophistication is not something typically associated with the technology of the time. While the Greeks had knowledge of geometry and astronomy, the application of that knowledge in the form of a complex mechanical device is unusual. It suggests a level of engineering capability that is not widely documented elsewhere in the archaeological record, which raises an immediate question. Was this an isolated invention, or part of a broader tradition that has not survived? Because if the Antikythera mechanism was a singular creation, it represents an extraordinary leap in technological development. But if it was part of a larger body of knowledge, then that knowledge has largely been lost. There are references in ancient texts to devices that resemble the mechanism in function. Writers such as Cicero described instruments that could model the movements of celestial bodies, but these descriptions are brief, lacking detail, and do not provide enough information to confirm the existence of similar devices. This leaves the Antikythera mechanism in a unique position. It is not entirely without context, but it is not fully supported by it either. Modern analysis of the mechanism has revealed a level of detail that continues to challenge expectations. Using imaging techniques such as X-ray tomography, researchers have been able to examine the internal structure without dismantling the fragile fragments. These studies have identified dozens of gears, each with a specific number of teeth, arranged in a system that reflects known astronomical cycles. The precision of these calculations is notable. The device accounts for irregularities in the moon's orbit. It incorporates cycles that align with observed patterns of eclipses. It translates complex mathematical relationships into mechanical motion. This is not a simple tool, it is a system. One that requires not only knowledge of astronomy, but also the ability to translate that knowledge into physical form, which involves design, measurement, and construction at a level that suggests specialized expertise. And yet, there is no clear record of where that expertise came from, or how widespread it was. The mechanism was found on a ship, suggesting that it was being transported, possibly as a valuable item. This implies that it was not a one-off experiment, but an object of significance. Something worth preserving, something worth moving. But where was it made? Who made it? And for what purpose? These questions remain open. One possibility is that the mechanism was created in a center of learning, such as Alexandria, where knowledge from different cultures converged. The Hellenistic period saw the exchange of ideas across regions, and it is possible that the device represents the culmination of that intellectual environment. If so, then the mechanism is not an anomaly, but a product of its time, a reflection of a moment when knowledge, resources, and skill aligned. But if that is the case, why are there no other examples? Why has no similar device been found? Why does the archaeological record not contain more evidence of such technology? These gaps are difficult to reconcile, because technological developments, especially those involving complex systems, tend to leave traces, tools, workshops, components. Yet in this case, the evidence is limited to a single object, fragmented, corroded, incomplete, and still remarkably advanced. There is also the question of function. While the mechanism is often described as an astronomical calculator, its exact use is not fully understood. It may have been used for education, to demonstrate celestial movements, to teach concepts related to time and cycles, or it may have served a practical purpose, helping to predict events that were significant for navigation, agriculture, or religious observance. It is also possible that it had symbolic value, representing the order of the cosmos, the relationship between time and motion, a physical embodiment of abstract ideas. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The device could have served multiple purposes: functional, educational, symbolic. But without direct evidence, its primary role remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Antikythera mechanism does not fit neatly into the narrative of technological progression. It appears too early, too complex, too isolated. It suggests that the development of technology is not always linear, that advancements can occur, reach a peak, and then be lost. Not because they were flawed, but because the conditions that supported them changed. Knowledge can be preserved, but it can also disappear, especially when it is not widely distributed, or when the systems that sustain it are disrupted. The fall of civilizations, the loss of institutions, the breakdown of networks, all of these can contribute to the disappearance of knowledge. The Antikythera mechanism may be an example of such a loss, a fragment of a tradition that did not survive. A piece of technology that was not passed down, or not widely enough to leave a lasting trace. It stands as a reminder that what we know is not the full extent of what once existed, that the past may have contained developments that are not fully represented in the record, and that the absence of evidence does not necessarily mean the absence of capability. The mechanism has been reconstructed in various forms, allowing researchers to simulate its operation and better understand its design. These reconstructions confirm its functionality. They demonstrate that it was not a theoretical object, but a working device, one that could produce accurate results, one that was built with intention and understanding. And yet, despite all this progress, the central questions remain, not how it worked, but why it was made, and why it is alone. Because the most unusual aspect of the Antikythera mechanism is not its complexity, it is its isolation, a single example of a technology that should have a lineage, but does not, or at least not one that has been found. It exists as a point, not clearly connected to what came before or after, and that makes it difficult to place, not in time, but in context. It is not an outlier because it is impossible. It is an outlier because it is incomplete, a fragment of a larger story that has not been fully recovered, and until that story is better understood, the mechanism will remain what it has always been, a machine that appears to anticipate the future, not because it came from it, but because it reflects a level of understanding that we did not expect to find in the past, and that expectation is what makes it so compelling, not the device itself, but what it suggests, that history may be more complex than the paths we have drawn, and that sometimes the most advanced ideas are not the ones that come last, but the ones that appear early and then disappear. In the dense jungles of Central America, hidden beneath layers of vegetation that have slowly reclaimed what was once a thriving human landscape, there exists the remains of a city that does not follow the expected pattern of decline. It is not marked by signs of destruction. It does not show evidence of invasion, fire, or sudden catastrophe, and yet, at some point in its history, it was simply left behind. This is the ancient Maya city of Tikal. At its peak, Tikal was one of the most powerful and influential centers in the Maya world. Its towering pyramids rose above the forest canopy, its plazas were filled with activity, and its population reached into the tens of thousands. It was a place of governance, religion, and daily life, structured with precision and sustained over centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals a city that was not only large, but highly organized. There were complex water management systems, including reservoirs designed to collect and store rainwater. There were causeways connecting different parts of the city, facilitating movement and communication. There were temples, administrative buildings, and residential areas, all integrated into a coherent urban environment. It was not a temporary settlement. It was a long-term investment, a city built to endure. And for a time, it did. But then something changed. By the end of the 9th century, the population of Tikal had declined significantly. Construction ceased. Monuments were no longer erected. The inscriptions that once recorded the activities of rulers and events simply stopped. And then, over time, the city was abandoned. Not abruptly, not violently, but gradually. This pattern is not unique to Tikal. Many Maya cities experienced similar declines during what is often referred to as the classic Maya collapse. But the term collapse may not accurately describe what happened, because what we see at Tikal is not the aftermath of a sudden failure. It is the result of a process, a series of changes that led to the eventual departure of its inhabitants. The question is not whether the city was abandoned, it is why. One of the most widely discussed explanations involves environmental factors. The region surrounding Tikal is characterized by seasonal rainfall and limited access to permanent water sources. The city's reservoirs were essential for sustaining its population, especially during dry periods. Studies of sediment cores taken from these reservoirs have revealed evidence of prolonged droughts during the period leading up to the city's decline. These droughts would have reduced water availability, affecting agriculture, sanitation, and daily life. This explanation is supported by data. It aligns with known climate patterns. It provides a plausible mechanism for stress on the population, but it does not fully explain the abandonment, because drought, while significant, does not necessarily lead to the complete desertion of a city. Populations can adapt. They can migrate temporarily. They can develop new strategies for survival. And in some cases they do. So while environmental stress may have been a factor, it may not have been the only one. Another explanation focuses on resource depletion. As the population of Tikal grew, so did the demand for food, building materials, and fuel. The surrounding forests would have been used extensively for construction and agriculture, leading to deforestation and soil degradation. Over time, this could reduce the land's ability to support the population. Crop yields would decline. Food shortages would increase. the system would become less sustainable. This explanation complements the drought theory. Together, they suggest a scenario in which environmental pressures and human activity combine to create conditions that were difficult to maintain. But again, this does not fully account for the pattern of abandonment, because the decline appears to have been uneven. Some areas of the city were abandoned earlier than others. Certain structures show continued use even as others fell into disrepair. This suggests that the process was not uniform, that different parts of the population responded in different ways. There is also the possibility of social and political factors. Tikal was not an isolated entity. It was part of a network of Maya cities, each with its own rulers, alliances, and conflicts. Inscriptions from earlier periods document wars, rivalries, and shifts in power. It is possible that internal instability or external pressure contributed to the city's decline. Changes in leadership, loss of influence, breakdown of administrative systems. These factors could weaken the structure of the society, making it more vulnerable to environmental stress. But here, the evidence becomes less direct. The inscriptions that might provide insight into these dynamics become scarce toward the end of the city's occupation. The record fades, and with it, the ability to trace events clearly. There is also the question of belief systems. The Maya worldview was closely tied to cycles of time, of nature, of celestial events. Rituals, ceremonies, and governance were often aligned with these cycles. If environmental conditions disrupted these patterns, it could have implications beyond the practical. It could affect the perceived relationship between people, their leaders, and the forces they believed governed the world. If crops failed, if water became scarce, if expected cycles did not occur, it could lead to a loss of confidence in established systems. This could contribute to social change, to migration, to the reorganization of communities. But again, this is difficult to measure. Belief leaves fewer physical traces than structures or tools, and interpreting it requires caution. What makes Tikal particularly notable is not just that it was abandoned, but how. There is no widespread evidence of destruction, no layers of ash indicating fire, no mass graves suggesting conflict. The buildings remain. The layout is intact. The infrastructure, though no longer maintained, is still visible. It is as if the city was paused, left in place, rather than erased. This suggests that the departure was not forced in a sudden way, but chosen, gradual, a response to changing conditions rather than an immediate threat. People left, not all at once, not in panic, but over time. As the factors influencing their lives shifted, this kind of abandonment is more difficult to interpret than a sudden event, because it does not leave a clear signature. It is not marked by a single cause, but by a combination of influences that interact over time: environmental stress, resource limitations, social dynamics, possibly others that are no longer visible. Together, they create a situation in which remaining becomes less viable, and leaving becomes the alternative. Where did the people go? Some likely moved to other Maya regions. Others may have formed smaller communities. The population did not disappear. But the city, as a central place, ceased to function, and the forest began to reclaim it. Trees grew through plazas. Roots shifted stones. Layers of vegetation covered structures. Over centuries, the city became part of the landscape. Not erased, but integrated. Its presence concealed, but not lost. Modern archaeology has brought Tikal back into view. Excavations have revealed its scale, its complexity, and its history, but the final phase of that history remains less defined. We can identify patterns, we can propose explanations, but we cannot point to a single moment and say, this is when it ended. Because it did not end in a moment. It ended in a process, and processes are harder to define. They do not have clear boundaries. They do not produce definitive markers. They unfold over time, and they leave behind traces that must be interpreted. The story of Tikal is not one of sudden collapse. It is one of gradual change, of adaptation and movement, of decisions made by individuals and groups in response to conditions that evolved. It challenges the idea that cities fail in dramatic ways, that they are destroyed, abandoned overnight, or erased by singular events. Instead, it suggests that decline can be quiet, incremental, difficult to observe in real time, but visible in retrospect. And that visibility depends on what remains: structures, artifacts, environmental data. Each piece contributes to the picture, but none provide the full view. Tikal stands as a reminder that even the most established systems are subject to change, that stability is not permanent, and that the reasons for transformation are often complex, not singular, not obvious, but layered, like the city itself, built over time, and then, over time, left behind, not because it could not exist, but because the conditions that supported it no longer did. And in that shift, the city became something else, not a center of life, but a record of it, preserved in stone, hidden in forest, and waiting to be understood, not as a sudden disappearance, but as a gradual departure, one that leaves behind a question not of how it ended, but of how long it took to realize it was ending at all. In the frozen expanse of Antarctica, where temperatures fall far below anything most environments can sustain, and the landscape is defined more by absence than presence, there exists a structure that does not belong to its surroundings. It is not ancient in the way most mysteries are. It does not come from a distant civilization or an unknown culture, and yet it presents a question that is just as difficult to answer, because it was built with intention, maintained for a time, and then left behind. This is the case of the Antarctic huts. At first glance, they appear simple. Wooden structures, weathered by extreme conditions, partially buried in snow and ice. They are not large, not complex, and not hidden. In fact, they are well documented. Built during the early 20th century by explorers such as Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton, these huts were intended as bases for expeditions into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. They were stocked with supplies, food, tools, equipment necessary for survival. Every item placed with purpose, every decision made in response to conditions that allowed no room for error. These were not temporary shelters in the casual sense. They were carefully planned installations, points of stability in a landscape defined by unpredictability. And for a time, they served their function. Explorers lived in them, worked from them, prepared for journeys that would push the limits of human endurance. But then, something changed. Not in a dramatic way, not through destruction or loss, but through departure. The huts were left behind, abandoned. And yet, unlike most abandoned structures, they were not emptied. They were not dismantled. They were not reclaimed by subsequent use. Instead, they were left almost exactly as they had been. Inside, objects remain in place. Clothing hangs where it was last used. Food tins sit on shelves. Tools lie where they were set down. Even personal items, letters, photographs, small belongings remain untouched. It is as if the occupants left with the intention of returning, but never did. This creates a peculiar situation. Because the huts are not ruins in the traditional sense, they have not decayed in the way structures normally do over time. The cold, dry conditions of Antarctica have preserved them with unusual clarity. Organic materials that would decompose elsewhere remain intact. Metal objects show minimal corrosion. Wood retains its structure. The environment, in this case, acts not as a force of destruction, but of preservation. And this preservation captures a moment. Not just the structure itself, but the state in which it was left. A snapshot. A fixed point in time. This raises a question that is less about what the huts are and more about what they represent. Because they are not mysterious in origin. We know who built them. We know when. We know when. But the way they were left introduces a different kind of uncertainty. Not about their creation, but about their conclusion. Why were they not cleared? Why were the contents not removed? Why do they appear as if they were meant to be used again? One explanation is practical. The conditions in Antarctica are extreme. Returning to these huts after expeditions ended may not have been feasible or necessary. The cost, risk, and effort required to retrieve items may have outweighed their value. In this view, the huts were left because there was no compelling reason to reclaim them. They had served their purpose, and once that purpose was fulfilled, they were no longer needed. This is a reasonable explanation, but it does not fully capture the impression left by the interiors, because the arrangement of objects suggests something more than simple abandonment. It suggests interruption, not in the sense of an emergency, but in the sense of an emergency. Tasks left unfinished. Items left in positions that imply continuation. This creates a subtle tension between what we know happened and what the environment suggests. We know the explorers left. We know the expeditions ended. But the huts do not reflect a clear ending. They reflect a pause, and that distinction matters, because it affects how we interpret the space. A cleared structure indicates closure, a finished chapter, but a structure left in use suggests something else, an expectation, a possibility. Even if that possibility was never realized, there is also the human element. The huts were not just functional spaces, they were lived in, occupied, filled with routines, decisions, and interactions. The objects inside are not just tools, they are traces of those experiences, and their preservation allows for a level of insight that is rare, because most historical environments are altered over time. Objects are moved, structures collapse, contexts are lost, but here, the context remains, and that creates a different kind of connection, not through interpretation, but through observation. The position of a chair, the placement of a tool, the arrangement of supplies. Each detail contributes to a picture of how the space was used and how it was left. This has led to efforts to preserve the huts as historical sites, not just as artifacts, but as environments, maintained in their current state to retain the information they contain. This involves careful management, controlling access, monitoring conditions, ensuring that the preservation process does not alter the original arrangement, because once that arrangement is changed, the context is lost, and with it, part of the meaning. The huts also raise questions about how we define abandonment. In many cases, abandonment implies neglect, a lack of care, a deterioration over time. But here, the structures are not neglected in the same way. They are preserved, not intentionally at first, but through environmental conditions, and now, through deliberate conservation. This creates a situation where abandonment and preservation coexist. The huts were left, but they were not lost. They remain accessible, visible, intact, and that challenges the usual relationship between time and decay, because instead of fading, the past remains present, not as a reconstruction, but as an original. This presence has implications for how we understand historical events. It allows for a level of detail that is often unavailable, but it also introduces limitations, because what we see is a single moment, not the entire process. We see the state of the huts when they were last used, but not the sequence of events that led to that state. We do not see the decisions made, the reasons behind them, the context that influenced them, only the result. And that result must be interpreted. The huts, in this sense, are not just structures, they are records. But incomplete ones, they provide data, but not explanation. They show what was left, but not why it was left that way. This distinction is important because it highlights the difference between evidence and understanding. Evidence can be preserved, but understanding requires context, and context is not always available. The Antarctic huts represent a unique intersection of preservation and absence. They preserve a moment, but they do not explain it fully. They show continuity, but they do not show conclusion. And that creates a particular kind of question, not about what happened, but about how to interpret what remains. Because the huts are not ambiguous in their origin, but they are ambiguous in their meaning, not in the broad sense, but in the details, in the choices reflected by what was left behind. And those choices are not always accessible. They belong to a time, a situation, and a set of conditions that are no longer present. We can infer, we can analyze, but we cannot fully reconstruct the experience. And that is where the idea of a message emerges. Not a message in the traditional sense, not something written or intended for others to read, but a message in the arrangement of objects, in the state of the environment, in what remains. It is a message without a sender, or perhaps more accurately, without a clear receiver, because it was not left for us. It was left as a consequence of action. And now we encounter it, not as participants, but as observers, trying to interpret something that was not meant to be interpreted in this way, and that creates a distance between the event and the understanding of it, a distance that cannot be fully closed. The huts remain, preserved, accessible, and silent. They do not change. They do not provide new information. They simply exist, as they were left. And in that stillness, they continue to present the same question. Not what happened, but what it means. To leave something behind, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation that never occurred. A moment suspended, a space waiting, and a message that was never meant to be received, yet remains, unchanged and unanswered. There is a pattern that begins to emerge when you step back and look at everything together. Not just one mystery, not just one place, not just one unexplained discovery, but a sequence, a repetition, a quiet consistency that connects things which at first seemed completely unrelated. A pyramid that was never finished, a tomb with the wrong body, a man preserved in a moment of fear, artifacts that appear and then disappear, a wall that stretches without purpose, a discovery that was never followed, a fire that should not have happened, skulls that do not fit the story, pipes embedded where they should not be, symbols that came before writing, an inscription no one can read, a mural that was never completed, a burial that contradicts itself, a map that does not belong to its time, a signal that appeared once and never again, a code that refuses to be broken, a machine that seems too advanced for its era, a city that faded without collapse, and structures left behind, as if someone intended to return. Individually, each of these can be explained, or at least approached, assigned a theory, placed into a category, natural, accidental, misinterpreted, incomplete. And in many cases, those explanations are reasonable. They follow logic. They align with what we understand. They fit within the boundaries of accepted knowledge. But when viewed together, something begins to feel different. Not because they prove something, but because they suggest something. A pattern not in the answers, but in the questions. Because each of these mysteries shares a common feature, not what they are, but what they lack: closure. They do not resolve, they do not conclude, they do not provide the kind of answers that allow the mind to rest. Instead, they stop, at a point where something is missing, a final step, a confirming detail, a piece that would make everything align. But that piece is not there, and that absence is consistent, across time, across geography, across completely different contexts. Which raises a possibility that is easy to overlook, that the most important aspect of these mysteries is not what we are trying to explain, but what we are expecting to find. Because the way we approach the past is shaped by patterns. We look for continuity, for progression, for cause and effect. We expect things to make sense, to follow from one point to another, to build, to evolve, to complete. And when something does not follow that pattern, we treat it as an exception, an anomaly, something to be corrected or explained away. But what if these are not exceptions? What if they are part of a different pattern? One that does not prioritize completion, one that does not require resolution, one where interruption, abandonment, and absence are not failures, but outcomes. Because in each of these cases there is a moment, a point where something was in progress, being built, being used, being understood, and then it stops, not always dramatically, not always suddenly, but definitively. Construction halts, use ends, records disappear, and what remains is not a finished product, but a fragment, a partial state, something that suggests intention without fulfilling it. This is not unusual in isolation. Projects are abandoned, plans change, circumstances shift, but the frequency with which this pattern appears across so many unrelated contexts invites a different kind of question. Not what happened in each case, but why this pattern repeats at all. Why so many things in history appear to reach a point and then not continue, and more importantly, Why that point is often the one we encounter. Not the beginning, not the full duration, but the interruption, the unfinished state, the moment just before something would have been completed. Because that is what we see again and again, not the full story, but the point where it becomes incomplete. And that has implications, not about the past itself, but about how we access it. Because everything we know about history comes from what remains, from what was preserved, from what survived. And what survived is not always representative. It is selective, shaped by time, environment, and chance. Which means that what we interpret as patterns in the past may, in part, be patterns in preservation. We are not seeing everything that happened, we are seeing what was left behind, and what is left behind may be biased towards certain kinds of moments. Moments of interruption, moments where something was stopped, moments where objects, structures, or signals were not carried forward, but stayed where they were, and became part of the record. This does not diminish the mysteries, it reframes them, because instead of asking only what these things are, or how they came to be, we begin to ask a different question. Why these moments? Why these fragments? Why these incomplete states? And what does that tell us about the nature of history itself? Because history is often presented as a sequence of completed events, things that began, developed, and ended. But the evidence we rely on does not always reflect that. It reflects interruption, discontinuity, absence, which means that our understanding is built not just on what happened, but on what did not continue, and that distinction matters, because it suggests that there may be entire processes, systems, or developments that we do not fully see, not because they did not exist, but because they did not leave behind the kind of evidence we recognize, or because the evidence they left is not complete enough to reconstruct. The Antikythera mechanism may not be unique, it may be the only one that survived. The Vingueta symbols may not be isolated. They may be part of a broader system that did not persist. The wow signal may not be singular. It may be one instance of something that occurs under conditions we do not yet understand. The abandoned structures, the unfinished works, the unresolved findings, they may not represent failures. They may represent points of transition, moments where one phase ended and another began. But the beginning of that next phase is not always preserved. So we are left with the end of the previous one. And that end appears incomplete, not because it was meant to be, but because we are only seeing part of it. This perspective does not solve the mysteries. It does not provide definitive answers, but it changes the way the questions are framed. From isolated puzzles to parts of a broader pattern, a pattern not of what is known, but of what is left. And what is left is often what was not finished, not followed, not continued, not returned to. Which brings us back to the idea that runs through all of these cases. Not the mystery of what happened, but the mystery of why it stopped. Why something that had direction lost it? Why something that had purpose did not reach it? Why something that was in progress remained that way? Because in the end, that may be the most consistent element across all of these examples, not the unknown, but the incomplete. And perhaps the most important question is not whether we will ever find the missing pieces, but whether those pieces still exist at all, or whether what we see now is all that remains. Fragments of processes that ended in ways we do not fully understand and may never be able to reconstruct completely. Because sometimes the past does not leave behind answers. It leaves behind edges, points where something continues beyond what we can observe. And it is at those edges that we begin to realize something, that history is not just a record of what happened, it is a record of what remained. And what remained is not always enough, but it is all we have. And so the question is not just what these mysteries are, but what they represent, not individually, but collectively. Because when you look at them together, they are not just stories of the unknown, they are reminders of the limits of knowing, and that may be the most important thing they leave behind. And if there is one final thread that quietly runs beneath everything we have explored, it is this unsettling realization that what we call understanding is often built on fragments that survived rather than the full reality that once existed, and that distinction, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. Because when we look at the past, we are not observing it directly. We are reconstructing it from what remains after time has removed most of the original structure. Every artifact, every structure, every signal, every unexplained anomaly is not just a piece of history, but a survivor of selection shaped by forces that determined what would last and what would vanish. This means that what feels unusual or mysterious to us may not have been unusual at all within its original context. It may have been part of a system, a pattern, or a continuity that we simply cannot see anymore because the rest of it is gone. The unfinished pyramid may not have been abandoned in the way we imagine, but part of a larger sequence of constructions that we no longer have access to. The misplaced body in the tomb may not have been an anomaly, but one instance of a practice that was more common than the record suggests. The signal that appeared once and never again may not have been unique, but only the one moment we happen to capture. And this introduces a deeper level of uncertainty, not just about the mysteries themselves, but about the framework we use to interpret them. Because if our perspective is shaped by incomplete data, then our conclusions, no matter how logical, are built on a foundation that is inherently partial. This does not mean that everything is unknowable, or that all interpretations are equally valid, but it does mean that certainty must be approached with caution. It means recognizing that patterns we perceive may be influenced as much by what is missing as by what is present. And perhaps more importantly, it means accepting that some questions may not have answers that can be fully recovered, not because they are beyond comprehension, but because the information required to resolve them no longer exists in a form we can access. This is where the nature of mystery changes. It is no longer just about solving a puzzle or uncovering a hidden truth. It becomes about understanding the limits of reconstruction itself, about acknowledging that there are edges to what can be known, not because of a lack of effort or intelligence, but because of the way time reshapes information. And yet within that limitation there is something else, something that continues to drive inquiry forward. Because even if complete answers are out of reach, the process of questioning, of analyzing, of comparing and reevaluating still expands understanding. Each mystery, whether resolved or not, contributes to a broader awareness of how complex and layered reality can be. It challenges assumptions, refines methods, and forces a reconsideration of what is taken for granted. The Antikythera mechanism does not just raise questions about ancient technology, it changes expectations about what was possible. The undeciphered script does not just resist translation, it expands the boundaries of how language itself is defined. The abandoned city does not just represent decline, it reshapes how societal change is understood. In this way, mysteries are not obstacles to knowledge, they are part of its structure. They mark the points where current understanding reaches its limit and must either adapt or expand. They highlight areas where assumptions may need to be revised, where new methods may be required, or where entirely different approaches may be necessary. And this process is ongoing. What is unexplained today may become understood tomorrow, not because the mystery changes, but because the tools and perspectives applied to it evolve. But even as some mysteries are resolved, others will remain, and new ones will emerge. Because the world, both past and present, is not a closed system. It is dynamic, layered, and constantly revealing aspects that were previously unnoticed or misunderstood. This means that the presence of mystery is not a sign of failure, but a reflection of depth. A reminder that there is more to explore, more to question, and more to learn. And perhaps that is the most important perspective to carry forward, not the expectation that every question will be answered, but the recognition that the value of inquiry lies not only in resolution, but in the expansion of understanding that occurs along the way. Because in the end, what we are left with is not just a collection of unexplained phenomena, but a deeper awareness of how knowledge itself is constructed. An awareness that encourages humility, curiosity, and a willingness to engage with uncertainty rather than avoid it. And in that space between what is known and what is not there is something that continues to move us forward, not toward a final answer, but toward a more complete understanding of the questions themselves.